She had $300 million in her bank account, a cover feature in Forbes, and a diamond ring on her left hand. She also had a bathroom floor in a hospital in Charlotte, where she sat alone at 2 in the morning, pressing her palm flat against a body that no longer felt like her own, while the man who had promised to love her forever was in the waiting room, already texting someone else. Victoria Hale had survived board meetings that made grown men cry. She did not survive the look on Marcus Langford's face the first time he saw her scars. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel like too much and not enough at the same time, stay with me. This story is for you. Drop your city in the comments right now so I can see how far this story travels. And don't forget to hit that like button before we begin. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, which Victoria would later remember not because of the date, but because of the rain. It came down sideways, the kind of cold, angry North Carolina rain that soaks through a good coat in 30 seconds and turns gravel driveways into shallow rivers. The movers her assistant had hired stood under the back of the truck looking miserable, hauling boxes labeled in her neat, precise handwriting. Kitchen, books, office, things I'm not ready to deal with yet. That last one written in a moment of honesty she immediately regretted. Victoria stood beside her rental car with her arms crossed and her hood pulled low, watching them work with the blank expression she had spent years perfecting in boardrooms. She looked controlled. She looked like a woman who had made a decision and was at peace with it. She was neither of those things. "You don't have to stand out in the rain supervising them," her mother called from the porch. Eleanor Hale was 61 years old, small-framed and sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that had never learned how to be anything other than completely honest. She was holding a mug of coffee in both hands and looking at her daughter the way she'd looked at her since the hospital call 4 months ago. Like she was something precious that had been dropped, and she was still checking for cracks. "Come inside. I made the good coffee." "I'm fine, Mom." "Victoria." I said I'm fine. Eleanor pressed her lips together and said nothing more. That was the thing about her mother. She knew when to push and when to let something sit. Victoria had inherited exactly 0% of that quality. She turned back to the truck and watched a mover struggle with a box that had been taped badly. Her own fault. She'd packed half of it at midnight while slightly drunk on expensive Bordeaux, and a level of self-pity she'd never admit to anyone. The box sagged in the middle. She'd known it would. She'd taped it anyway. Story of the last 6 months, really. Victoria Hale had not planned to come back to Calder Creek, North Carolina. Calder Creek was the kind of small town that appeared in 2 places: in lifestyle magazine spreads about hidden gem communities, and in the childhood memories of people who spent their adult lives actively trying to escape it. Population just under 12,000. One main street with a barbecue place, a flower shop that doubled as a gossip hub, a diner that hadn't updated its menu since 2003, and a hardware store owned by a man named Dale, who somehow knew the personal business of every resident within 48 hours of anything happening. Victoria had left at 18 for Duke, then Stanford for her MBA, then San Francisco where she'd built Hale Logic from a 2-person operation in a rented office above a Vietnamese restaurant into one of the fastest-growing data infrastructure companies in the country. By 26, she'd taken her first institutional funding round. By 28, she was on the cover of Forbes Under 30. By 29, she was worth $340 million on paper. Engaged to Marcus Langford, venture capitalist, Harvard MBA, handsome in the way that photographed extremely well, and moving into a penthouse in San Francisco's Pacific Heights neighborhood with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the bay that cost more per month than most people earned in a year. She had been, by every measurable external standard, doing extraordinarily well. Then came the diagnosis. Ovarian torsion, caught late because she'd been ignoring symptoms for 2 months while closing a Series C round. Emergency surgery. Complications. Another surgery. More complications. 3 weeks in the hospital, during which time she lost 8 pounds, her appetite, her sleep schedule, and a piece of herself she was still struggling to name. The surgery hadn't taken everything. Her doctors had been careful, had preserved what they could, had used words like hopeful and wait and see in tones that were meant to be reassuring. But her body was different afterward, scarred in ways that weren't always visible, changed in ways she hadn't had the time or language to fully process yet. Marcus had been there throughout, publicly, visibly, photographically. He'd posted on Instagram from the hospital waiting room, a carefully composed caption about strength and partnership that got 40,000 likes. He'd brought flowers twice. He'd held her hand when the nurses were present. But somewhere between the first surgery and the second one, something in him had shifted. She'd noticed it first in small things. The way he'd stopped reaching for her in bed. The way certain conversations ended too quickly. The way his eyes occasionally passed over her body with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something careful, something practiced, something that wasn't desire. She told herself she was imagining it. She was recovering from surgery. She was emotional. She was reading into normal tiredness and stress. Marcus was busy. Marcus was managing his own fear. She was projecting. She'd believed that version of events for almost 2 months. Then came the night she'd gotten up at 1 in the morning to get water and heard his voice drifting from the living room. Low, serious, with the particular quality his voice got when he thought no one was listening. She'd stood in the hallway in the dark, in her hospital-issue compression socks and her college sweatshirt, and listened to her fiancé tell his brother, in a voice so flat it was almost clinical, that he wasn't sure he could do it anymore, that it wasn't what he signed up for, that she was different now and he didn't know how to explain it, but the attraction just wasn't there in the same way, and he didn't know if that was something that would come back or if it was just. She had walked back to the bedroom. She had sat on the edge of the bed for 4 hours. At 6 in the morning, when Marcus came to bed and put his arm around her with the automatic ease of a man who had no idea he'd just destroyed something, she had stared at the ceiling and felt something inside her go perfectly, completely quiet. Not numb. Quiet. Like a room after everyone has left. She had given him 3 more weeks after that. She was never entirely sure why. Maybe she'd needed to give herself time to be wrong, to let the possibility exist that she'd misunderstood, that there was some context or explanation she was missing, or maybe she just needed time to figure out where she was going to go. In the end, Marcus had actually been the one to end it, sitting across from her at their kitchen table with the careful expression of a man who had prepared this conversation, who had rehearsed it, who was delivering it with the particular controlled sensitivity of someone who wanted to feel like the good guy in a story that didn't have one. He'd said it wasn't working. He'd said they wanted different things. He'd said, and this one, this specific collection of words, had lodged in her chest like a splinter she couldn't reach, that he hoped she would find someone who could give her everything she deserved, as though the problem was his generosity, as though his departure was a gift. Victoria had looked at him across their kitchen table in their Pacific Heights penthouse, with its bay view and its beautiful light, and she had said, very calmly, "Take your ring back. I don't want it." And then she had gone to call her mother. Calder Creek was never supposed to be more than a temporary landing. 3 months? Maybe 4? Enough time to breathe, to figure out the next version of her life, to stop waking up at 3 in the morning, reaching for a person who had already decided she wasn't worth staying for. She'd taken a leave of absence from Hale Logic. Her COO, a supremely capable woman named Denise who had been running the day-to-day operations for 2 years anyway, had looked at her during their last video call with an expression that was equal parts concern and relief. "Take as long as you need," Denise had said, and had clearly meant it. Victoria had told herself she'd be back in 90 days. She was now on day 47, standing in her mother's rain-soaked driveway in a sweatshirt that was 3 sizes too big, watching strangers carry boxes of her life into a house she'd grown up in, and she had no idea when she was going home. That was the word she kept tripping over. Home. She'd had a penthouse in San Francisco. She'd had a company valued at close to $1 billion. She'd had a life that people literally photographed and posted about and referenced in conversations about ambition and success. Standing in her mother's driveway in the rain, all of it felt like it belonged to someone else. The second truck pulled up just as the movers were finishing with the first load. It was a white pickup, not new, not particularly clean, with a back bed full of moving pads and a tool chest bolted behind the cab. Victoria noticed it because it parked at an angle that was slightly inconsiderate to the movers trying to maneuver around it, and she was already formulating a politely sharp thing to say when the driver's door opened. She registered him in pieces, the way you register things when you're tired and wet and your head isn't fully present. Work boots caked in sawdust, dark jeans, a flannel jacket that had clearly been washed too many times, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who used their body for actual work rather than a gym membership. Dark hair, short on the sides, slightly too long on top in a way that looked accidental rather than styled. He was reaching into the truck bed for something, his back to her, and Victoria had already looked away when he turned around. Then he looked up and she realized who he was. "Well," said Ethan Carter. He had a half smile that she remembered from 15 years ago, wry, slightly reluctant, like his face was doing it without full cooperation from the rest of him. Victoria Hale. She stared at him. Carter, she said finally. Your mom called. Said she needed someone to help move some furniture into the back bedroom. He held up the moving pads. Figured I'd help. She had known Ethan Carter in the way you know the older brother of your best friend, peripherally, occasionally, and mostly as a source of mild irritation. His younger sister, Josie, had been Victoria's closest friend from 7th grade through their senior year of high school, which had meant regular exposure to Ethan, the guy who drove them to the mall in a truck with a busted heater, who ate the last of everything in the refrigerator, who gave unsolicited opinions about whatever Victoria was doing with her hair, and who had the infuriating quality of being right about approximately 60% of the things he said while being completely insufferable about it. She had not seen him since Josie's wedding 6 years ago, where they'd exchanged maybe 40 words and he'd spent most of the reception chasing a 3-year-old girl in a flower girl dress, who, Victoria now recalled, was apparently his daughter. He looked different, not unrecognizably. His face was the same basic architecture, same dark eyes, same jaw. But there was something more settled about him now, more weight to him, not physically, but in the way he stood, the way he looked at things. Like someone who had also gone through a version of something hard and come out the other side with fewer edges. You look like you need a hot drink, he said. I look fine. You look like you've been standing in the rain for 40 minutes. She glanced down at herself. Her sweatshirt had a water stain across the left shoulder. Her wet hair was doing something she didn't want to think about. She looked, objectively, terrible. The furniture is in the truck, she said. The back bedroom has a narrow doorway. I know, he said. Your mom already warned me. He paused, that half smile surfacing again. She also told me you were going through a hard time and to be patient with you. Victoria closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. She did not. She absolutely did. He picked up the moving pad and started toward the truck. You can yell at her about it inside where it's warm. I was good at the furniture thing. Victoria would not say this out loud, but she noticed it the way she noticed competence in people, with a kind of involuntary attention she couldn't fully suppress. He moved a 19th century secretary desk through the narrow hallway on the first try without touching either wall, which she knew for a fact her last set of movers had refused to attempt. He was methodical without being slow, careful without being precious, and he gave instructions to the actual movers with the comfortable authority of someone used to working with his hands and other people. He also didn't talk to her much while they worked, which she appreciated. Eleanor hovered in the kitchen, making things, and occasionally materializing in doorways to ask if anyone needed anything, which was her mother's way of monitoring everything without being accused of monitoring anything. Victoria caught her watching Ethan with an expression she recognized and did not love. The soft, speculative look of a woman whose internal matchmaking engine had just turned on. Mom, Victoria said, appearing in the kitchen doorway while Ethan was in the back bedroom. Eleanor looked up from the cutting board with wide, innocent eyes. What? No. I didn't say anything. You were thinking very loudly. I was thinking about dinner. You were not. Victoria kept her voice level. He's Josie's brother. He's here because you called him. He's going to leave when the furniture is moved, and that's the end of it. I am not... She stopped, recalibrated. I'm not in a place for anything. I'm not interested. And even if I were, I don't want you to... I just need you to not do anything, okay? Nothing. Can you do that? Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long moment, really looked at her, in that particular way that felt like being read, and then nodded once. Of course, she said. Thank you. There's coffee on the counter for when he's done. Mom. It's just coffee, Victoria. She didn't mean to stay outside when Ethan was leaving. She had fully intended to be inside, or at least to say a brief professional thank you at the door like a normal person with normal levels of social function. But she'd walked out to check the driveway for anything the movers had left behind, and he'd been there, tossing the moving pads into his truck bed, and it had been too late to retreat without being obvious about it. That desk didn't move easily, she said. He glanced back at her. No. Thank you, for getting it through the hall. Tight door frame. You lose about 3 inches on the hinge side that people don't account for. He closed the truck bed. Your mom says you're staying a while. A few months. He nodded, not pushing it. The rain had eased to a drizzle. The streetlights on her mother's block were coming on, amber against the gray early evening, and the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke from somewhere down the road was so specifically, so exactly, Calder Creek that it hit her in the chest in a way she wasn't prepared for. She had not cried since the morning she'd called her mother from San Francisco. She'd made a decision about that. Josie told me things were rough, Ethan said. He wasn't looking at her when he said it. He was looking at the street, his hands in his jacket pockets. She wanted to come, actually. I told her to give you some space first. Victoria appreciated that he hadn't dressed it up. Rough was an honest word. It didn't reach for too much. She doesn't have to give me space, Victoria said. I'm not fragile. He was quiet for a beat. I know you're not, he said simply. She didn't know why that specific answer undid something in her just slightly, not enough to show, but she felt it. Your shop is still over on Merchant Street? She asked, mostly to redirect. Still there. He opened the driver's door. Come by sometime if you get bored. I'll put you to work. I don't do manual labor. You don't even know what I'd have you do. I'm guessing it involves sandpaper. It involves a lot of things. The half smile again. But the coffee's good. He got in the truck. She stood on the wet gravel and watched it pull out of the driveway with the particular care of someone maneuvering a vehicle they didn't want to scrape, and then listened to it until she couldn't hear it anymore. Her mother appeared in the doorway behind her. Not a word, Victoria said. I was just going to say dinner's ready, Eleanor said, in a tone of absolute innocence. She started driving past Merchant Street on day 11. She told herself it was because the coffee shop she liked was on that block. There was a place called Blue Morning that she'd started going to every day, partly for the coffee, and partly because it was one of the few places in Calder Creek where she could sit with her laptop and have some version of professional normalcy. Without 3 people she went to high school with, stopping at her table to ask how she was doing in the tone that meant they already knew the answer. But she drove past the workshop. She could see it from the street, a long converted building with high windows, Carter Restoration in clean letters on the faded brick above the entrance. The door was always open when she drove by in the morning. She could see the light inside, warm and yellowish, and occasionally the shape of Ethan moving around what looked like an enormous old wardrobe positioned near the window. She stopped on day 14. She told herself it was because she needed to ask him about a dresser in her mother's guest room that wouldn't close properly. She did need to ask him about that. That part was true. He looked up from a workbench when she came in and didn't seem surprised to see her, which she was slightly annoyed by. The workshop smelled like sawdust and linseed oil and something she couldn't identify, but that her brain filed under old things being made new, which was either poetic or embarrassing. She wasn't sure. Dresser won't close, she said. He put down his chisel. Which one? Guest room, old oak piece, the second drawer from the top. Humidity, he said. Wood swells. Give it a week and it'll sort itself, or, he considered. Bring me the drawer and I'll plane the edge. She looked around the workshop. There were 3 pieces in progress. The wardrobe by the window, what looked like the carcass of an antique roll-top desk in the center of the space, and something she couldn't identify covered in a moving blanket in the corner. What's that? She asked, nodding toward the covered piece. Chair. What kind? He crossed to it and pulled back the corner of the blanket. Beneath it was the wreckage of what had once been an armchair, stripped back to bare wood and webbing, the frame intact but everything else gone, waiting to be rebuilt. Victorian parlor chair, he said. 1880s. Client found it in her grandmother's attic. Half the joints are broken, the upholstery is gone, the back leg is cracked. He crouched down and pointed along the frame. But the bones are solid. Everything that matters is still there. Victoria looked at the stripped chair for a moment. Doesn't look like much, she said. Not yet. She stayed for an hour. She wasn't sure exactly how that happened. One question led to another, and then she was perched on a stool near the workbench, watching him work on the wardrobe, and they were talking. Not about anything serious, mostly about the town and what had changed and what hadn't. About Josie, who was living in Raleigh with her husband and was apparently pregnant with her second, and hadn't told their mother yet, which was, Ethan said with a dry expression, going to go approximately as well as you'd expect. Victoria laughed. An actual laugh, not the practiced social version she'd been deploying for months. She noticed it the same way you'd notice a cramp you'd had for so long you'd forgotten it was there, suddenly releasing. When she left, she told herself she wasn't coming back. She came back the next day. By the 3rd week, it had become a routine. She would come around 10 or 11, usually with coffee, She'd started getting to it blue morning without entirely deciding to, and she would take her stool near the workbench and either work on her laptop or watch him or talk. And at some point it would be past 1, and she'd realize she'd been there for 2 hours and hadn't thought about San Francisco once. It was not a friendship, exactly. It was something that didn't have a clean name, comfortable and slightly spiky, the way things are when you've known someone long enough to skip the performance of getting to know each other, but not so long that you've run out of things to discover. She criticized his tools, which were old and specifically curated, and she would have spent 20 minutes explaining to him why the newer German chisels were demonstrably better if he'd shown the slightest interest in agreeing with her. He did not. "These are fine," he said. "They're 15 years old. They work. Efficiency is, I'm making furniture, not running a factory." He looked at her over his shoulder. "You know what your problem is? I'm sure you're going to tell me. You think faster is always better. Faster is usually better." He turned back to the wardrobe. "How's that working out lately?" She opened her mouth, closed it. He didn't push. He just let it sit there, completely unbothered, which was either the most irritating thing about him or the thing she was most secretly grateful for. She couldn't entirely decide which. Yet, she was careful about herself inside the workshop. She wore the oversized sweatshirts. She sat at angles that didn't require her to think about how she looked. When she reached for things, she did it in a way she'd learned in the months since surgery. Economical, unself-conscious, avoiding the particular movements that made her feel the pull of the scar tissue and remember. She didn't own full-length mirrors anymore. She'd stopped buying fitted clothes. She'd packed away about a third of her wardrobe and told herself she'd figure out the rest when she was ready, which she hadn't been. Some mornings she got up and was completely fine. She moved through the house like herself, made decisions, answered emails, felt like a functional person. Some mornings she sat on the edge of the bathtub for 20 minutes and just breathed. She didn't tell anyone about those mornings. She smiled at her mother over breakfast and said she'd slept fine. Ethan never asked her how she was doing in the tone that required an honest answer. He'd ask things like, "You eaten? I've got half a sandwich," or "You look tired, take that stool," or "Josie says you're not answering her texts." Practical things. Slightly bossy things sometimes. Things that didn't require her to be okay, but also didn't require her to perform her suffering. She didn't know it at the time, but this was the most valuable thing anyone had done for her in months. On a Thursday evening in mid-November, Victoria came home from the workshop later than usual. Her mother had gone to book club, the actual book club that genuinely discussed books, not the wine and gossip circuit, Eleanor was quick to clarify. Though from what Victoria had observed, it was roughly equal portions of both. The house was quiet when Victoria let herself in. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and then went and found the half-open bottle of wine she'd been nursing for 3 days and poured herself a glass. She took it to the front porch. It was cold. Not winter yet, but the kind of cold that felt personal, damp and insistent, the kind that got through whatever you were wearing if you stood in it long enough. She wrapped the blanket from the porch bench around her shoulders and sat. The street was quiet. One car passed. Down the block, the Morrisons had hung Christmas lights already, which was aggressive for November, but also, she had to admit, looked kind of beautiful against the dark. She sat there and did not think about San Francisco. She thought about something worse, actually. She thought about this version of herself that had existed before the surgery, the one who'd moved through the world with a particular kind of ease. Not arrogance exactly, but certainty. The certainty of someone who'd built something real from nothing, who'd looked in mirrors and known exactly what they were working with, who'd been desired by a man she loved, and had never had reason to question whether that desire was conditional. That version of herself felt very far away, and the horrible, shameful thing she could barely let herself think directly, the thing she'd said to no one, not even her mother, was the question underneath it all. What if he was right? What if Marcus, for all his cowardice and his rehearsed kindness and his careful departure, had simply been honest about something that was true? What if the surgery had changed something that couldn't be recovered? What if the next person she let close would look at her the same way, with that practiced, careful expression she'd read on his face the night she'd overheard him, and she'd have to live through it again? She was sitting with this thought, her wine getting cold, her blanket not really doing its job, when headlights swept across the porch. Ethan's truck pulled up to the curb. He got out and came up the walk with his hands in his jacket pockets, and when he saw her on the porch, he didn't look surprised, just slightly careful. Josie asked me to check on you, he said from the bottom of the steps. She said you went quiet on her texts. I'm fine. He looked at her, her blanket, her wine glass. Sure, he said. She should have sent him home. She had her cover story all ready. Just getting some air, long day. I'll text Josie in the morning. She'd used versions of that response so many times it came automatically now, like a reflex, like snapping a hand back from a flame. But she was so tired. She was so tired of the automatic response. Sit down if you want, she said. He came up the steps and sat on the other end of the porch bench, giving her plenty of room, and looked out at the street the way he looked at most things, like he had nowhere better to be and no deadline on being there. They sat in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable, just quiet. I keep thinking about something he said, she said finally. She hadn't planned to say it. Her voice came out slightly flat, and she looked at her wine glass. My ex, Marcus. He didn't say anything cruel when he left. He was very careful about it, very considered. She paused. But I heard him talking to his brother once, before he officially ended it, and he said... She stopped, pressed her lips together, tried to find a way to say it that wouldn't require her to feel it. He said the attraction wasn't there in the same way. After the surgery, that I was different. Ethan didn't say anything. And the thing is, she continued, her voice dropping slightly, I've had 4 months to decide he was wrong, or that he was a coward, or that he said it in a moment of weakness, and it didn't reflect... She stopped again, set the wine glass down carefully on the porch railing. But it's still there, that sentence, in my head, and I can't... She exhaled. I can't stop wondering if he was just honest about something that's true. She said it quietly, not dramatically, like a confession you make to a porch in the dark. I can't stop wondering if I'm something that people can't want anymore, not the way they used to. The street was quiet. Down the block, the Christmas lights blinked once, steady. I know that sounds... She started. No, Ethan said, not sharply, not dismissively, just with a kind of plain certainty, the way you correct a mathematical error. It doesn't sound like anything. It sounds like what happens when someone says something cruel to you and you had to listen to it alone. She looked at him. He was looking at the street, not at her. I wasn't honest, Ethan said. He was weak. There's a difference. Honest is when you look at someone and tell them the truth to their face. What he did was talk to his brother in the dark and let you overhear it, and then he left. He paused. That's not someone being honest about what's true. That's someone looking for an exit and using your surgery as the door. Victoria stared at the side of his face for a long moment. She had been told variations of this before. Her therapist in San Francisco, her college roommate who had called her 14 times in the first month, even her mother, in Eleanor's careful, chosen words way. But none of them had said it like that, without comfort first, without softening it, without the reaching sympathy that always made Victoria feel like she was being handled. He'd just said it, like it was simply the accurate description of events. You don't know that, she said. I know a little bit about what it looks like when someone leaves because they're afraid, he said, and I know it has a way of making you think the problem is you. There was something in his voice, a very slight, careful thing, that she filed away to think about later. They sat on the porch until her wine was gone, and the cold had genuinely gotten through both their coats, and they talked about other things, inconsequential, wandering, easy things. Until Eleanor's car turned onto the block and Ethan stood up and said he should get back. Carter, Victoria said, as he reached the bottom of the steps. He turned. She didn't know what she'd meant to say. She had several options and none of them were right. Right. Thanks for the company, she said finally. He nodded once, got in his truck, drove away. Victoria stood on the cold porch with her empty wine glass and looked at the Christmas lights down the block and felt, for the first time in 4 months, like she was not entirely alone inside her own wreckage. It wasn't fixed. It wasn't even close to fixed. But it was something. Odd. The drawer from the guest room dresser sat in her car for 5 days before she brought it to the workshop. He planned the edge on a Tuesday afternoon in 20 minutes, talking the whole time about the grain of the wood, and why humidity was actually the enemy of all old furniture and why nobody had good baseline woodworking knowledge anymore, which she found slightly rich coming from a man who fixed antiques for a living and had a personal emotional investment in people not knowing what they were doing. You're basically arguing for your own job security, she said. I'm arguing for the preservation of beautiful old things. He tested the drawer edge, ran his thumb along it. Same difference. That's not the same difference at all. He handed her the drawer. Try it. She took it. Their fingers didn't quite touch, but almost. She pretended not to notice. He pretended to be looking at something else. Neither of them said anything, and outside the workshop on Merchant Street, the November sky went gray and then dark, and the light in the windows stayed on late into the evening, and from the street you could see two shapes, one working and one watching. And if you didn't know any better, they might have looked like people who had finally, after a long time of being somewhere else, found somewhere they could stay. The drawer fit perfectly after that. Victoria slid it back into the dresser in her mother's guest room on a Wednesday morning and stood there looking at it for longer than necessary. The way you look at something small that works after a long time of it not working, with a satisfaction that feels slightly out of proportion to the thing itself. She opened it, closed it, opened it again. Clean, smooth, no resistance. It was a drawer. It was just a drawer. She went downstairs and ate breakfast and told herself she wasn't going to the workshop that day because she'd been going almost every day for 3 weeks and she had actual work to do. Hale Logic still existed, Denise was handling it brilliantly, but there were board communications and a quarterly review that Victoria had been moving around her calendar like furniture she didn't want to deal with yet. She went to the workshop at 11. Ethan looked up when she came in, noted the coffee she was carrying, and went back to the roll-top desk he'd been working on for the past week. He'd gotten the carcass stabilized and was now piecing together the timbre, the flexible wooden slats that made the rolling top work, laid out on a long workbench like a puzzle someone had exploded. You know there are engineers who've spent actual years trying to reproduce that mechanism, Victoria said, setting his coffee near him and taking her stool. I know. Modern manufacturing can't do it as cleanly. I know that too. He picked up a slat and examined the tongue edge. You going to tell me something I don't know, or is this just the warm-up? She opened her laptop. I'm working. Ignore me. You never let me ignore you. I don't do that. He gave her a look that was so perfectly calibrated between amusement and diplomacy that she actually laughed, a short, slightly surprised sound, and turned back to her screen. She got maybe 40 minutes of real work done, which was 40 minutes more than she'd managed at her mother's kitchen table that morning. There was something about the workshop, the smell, the sounds of him working, the particular quality of the light through those high windows, that quieted the part of her brain that had been running at emergency volume for 5 months. She wasn't ready to examine why. She just let it work. Josie's coming down this weekend, Ethan said, without looking up from the timbre. Victoria's hands stilled on her keyboard. She tell you that? She told me she was coming to see Mom, and that she was planning to stop by here. He paused, chose his words with mild care. I figured you should know ahead of time, in case you wanted to be somewhere else. She understood what he meant. He was giving her an exit. No pressure, no expectation, just the information, clean and neutral, so she could choose. She thought about Josie, about the 43 texts she'd read but not answered over the past month, about the voicemail she'd listened to twice, where Josie's voice had cracked just slightly when she'd said, V, I'm not trying to fix anything. I just miss you. Please just let me know you're okay. I'll be here, Victoria said. Ethan nodded once and went back to the timbre. She went back to the quarterly review. Neither of them made it a big thing. She was beginning to understand one of his specific qualities, the ability to receive something significant without inflating it. She appreciated it more than she had words for. Josie arrived Saturday morning in a navy maternity coat that she was wearing open over a striped top, her dark hair pulled back, looking both more tired and more luminous than the last time Victoria had seen her. She pulled into Eleanor's driveway and got out of the car, and Victoria, who had been watching from the living room window like a 12-year-old and was mildly ashamed of herself for it, came out to the porch. They looked at each other across the driveway for a moment. Then Josie walked up the steps and hugged her. Not a careful hug, not a sympathetic hug, just a full, proper Josie hug, the kind that had always been slightly too long and too tight and didn't care. And Victoria stood there and let herself be held and did not cry, which she counted as a significant personal achievement. You look thinner, Josie said into her hair. You look rounder. Josie pulled back and looked at her. Her eyes were doing something complicated. Relief and worry and love, all fighting for the same square inch of expression. I've been so worried about you. I know, I'm sorry I went quiet. Don't apologize, just... Josie stopped, recalibrated. Are you okay? For real, not the version you tell people. Victoria looked at her best friend of 17 years, who had known her before the company and the money and the magazine covers, who had been the first person she'd called when she'd gotten the Duke acceptance letter, standing in her mother's driveway in November with her coat open over her pregnant belly. I'm better than I was, Victoria said. That's the honest answer. Josie nodded. Okay. She squeezed her hand once. That's enough. They spent the morning at Eleanor's kitchen table, drinking tea, talking carefully around some things and directly through others. Josie did not bring up Marcus by name. She had clearly made this decision ahead of time, and Victoria was grateful for it. They talked about Josie's pregnancy, about her husband Daniel's new job, about Eleanor's book club drama. Apparently there had been a heated disagreement over a novel that had fractured the group into two camps, the details of which were both extremely funny and completely incomprehensible to anyone not directly involved. It was ordinary, warm, the specific quality of comfort that only existed in conversations with people who had known you long enough that you didn't have to explain your own history. Victoria hadn't realized how hungry she'd been for it. In the afternoon, Josie said she wanted to stop by Ethan's workshop to drop something off, and looked at Victoria with a carefully neutral expression that was absolutely not neutral. I know that face, Victoria said. I don't have a face. Josie, I genuinely have something to drop off. He asked me to pick up a specific type of wood glue from the specialty store in Raleigh, and I got it. She produced a small paper bag from her coat pocket. See, this is not a pretense. The face is still happening. The face is my regular face. They drove over together. Ethan was working when they arrived. He'd switched from the timbre to a Windsor chair that needed new spindles, and was at the lathe at the back of the workshop, which meant they heard him before they saw him, the lathe running with a particular rhythm that reminded Victoria of something she couldn't immediately place. He turned it off when he heard the door and came forward wiping his hands on a cloth, and when he saw Josie, his whole face did something that it didn't usually do. It opened, just briefly, the careful economy of his expression giving way to something genuine and warm. Hey, he said. Hey yourself. Josie handed him the paper bag and let him hug her, or as much as the pregnant belly allowed. You look like you've been sleeping in here again. I haven't. There's sawdust in your hair in a way that implies overnight hours. It was a late project. He glanced at Victoria over Josie's shoulder, a brief, unreadable thing. You both want coffee? They stayed for an hour. Josie sat on the stool Victoria usually occupied, which Victoria noticed with a complicated feeling she declined to examine closely, and instead leaned against the workbench and drank her coffee, while Ethan and Josie talked with the easy, low-frequency affection of siblings who had gone through difficult things together and come out knowing each other's actual weight. She watched them together and thought about what she knew of Ethan's story, which was partial and pieced together from things Josie had mentioned over the years. The marriage in his mid-20s to a woman named Claire, who was, by Josie's account, genuinely wonderful and genuinely wrong for him. The daughter, Lily, now 7, who had Claire's coloring and Ethan's eyes. The divorce that had been mutual and sad and handled, apparently, with more dignity than most. The kind that left people on speaking terms and cooperative as parents, but also permanently altered something. Josie had once told her during a late-night phone call 2 years ago that Ethan had been quieter after the divorce. Not broken, she'd said. Her brother didn't break like that, just quieter. Like he'd moved certain parts of himself somewhere interior and wasn't in a hurry to bring them back out. Victoria had filed that away at the time with mild interest. She was thinking about it differently now. When they left, Josie waited until they were in the car, and then sat in the passenger seat, not starting the engine and not saying anything, which Victoria recognized as the setup to a conversation. Don't, Victoria said. I'm not doing anything. You're doing the pregnant pause thing, no pun intended. Josie turned to look at her. He likes you. Josie, I know you know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. I'm just... She paused, and her voice shifted to something more careful, more real. He doesn't let people in easily, V. He's been in that workshop basically by himself for 2 years, and the only person he's mentioned in conversation without me pulling it out of him is you. She let that sit for a second. I'm not telling you to do anything. I'm just telling you that what's happening in that workshop is not nothing. Victoria looked at the workshop through the windshield, the high windows, the warm light inside. I'm not in a place, she started. I know. Josie started the car. I'm not asking you to be. I'm just telling you the truth. She pulled out. You can do whatever you want with it. Victoria looked out the passenger window and said nothing, and the town moved past them in the gray November light, and she thought about the tambour pieces laid out like a puzzle. Someone had exploded, and the way he'd said the bones are solid. Everything that matters is still there. She didn't think about Marcus once on the drive home. She noticed that, and didn't know what to do with it, and eventually just let it be. The weeks moved the way weeks do in small towns in late fall. Slowly in the moment, suddenly fast in retrospect. November gave way to December with the particular abruptness that always surprised her, even though she'd experienced it 41 times. The town put up its Christmas decorations, which in Calder Creek meant a level of earnest commitment that San Francisco's tasteful, restrained holiday aesthetic had never come close to matching. Dale at the hardware store had a full mechanical reindeer display in the window. The diner had tinsel on everything, including, apparently, the ceiling fans. Victoria's days had developed a shape she hadn't intended to build. Mornings, coffee at Blue Morning, email, whatever board communication couldn't be put off any longer. Mid-morning through early afternoon. The workshop, sometimes working, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in the same space in a way that didn't require justification. Late afternoon. Back to her mother's for dinner, the two of them at the kitchen table, the evening news on in the background, Eleanor asking careful questions, and Victoria answering with more honesty than she managed anywhere else. It was a small life by her previous standards. Compressed. Quiet in ways that sometimes felt peaceful and sometimes felt like pressure building behind glass. But she was sleeping better. She hadn't noticed it happening. It was Ethan who mentioned it first, obliquely, the way he mentioned most things. You look less like you're running on 3 hours, he said one morning, not looking up from the Victorian chair he'd been slowly rebuilding. The one he'd shown her the first week, stripped to its bones. I slept 6 hours, she said, slightly surprised by the number as she said it. Good. That's the most I've slept since... She stopped. In a while. He nodded. Didn't comment further. Just let it be a good thing without making it into a moment. She watched him work for a few minutes. He was fitting new webbing to the chair's seat frame, a specific technique she'd watched him demonstrate once, working the straps over and under in a grid pattern with a flat tool, the tension even and precise. Where'd you learn that? She asked. My grandfather. He was a furniture maker, not restoration. He built things, mostly chairs, some tables. Ethan ran his thumb along the webbing, checking the tension. He used to say you could tell everything about a craftsman by the way they treated the part nobody would see. The underside. The underside, the back, the inside of a drawer. He looked up briefly. The parts that don't make the sale. She thought about that for a moment. Marcus was very good at the visible parts, she said, not sure why she said it. Ethan looked at her. He was, she continued, neutrally. Everything looked exactly right. The way he spoke in public, the way he held my hand, the Instagram post from the hospital waiting room. She paused. It was all technically correct. Just not actually true. Just not actually true. Ethan set down the flat tool. He was looking at her steadily, without the careful neutrality he usually maintained. Something slightly more direct in his expression. Can I ask you something? He said. You're going to anyway. When did you stop trusting your own read of people? She opened her mouth, closed it. Because I've watched you in here for 3 weeks, he continued, and you're one of the sharpest people I've ever been around. You see things. You read situations. You knew that timbre mechanism was relevant before I explained it. He paused. But when it comes to yourself, what people think of you, what you're worth to someone, it's like all of that stops working. The workshop was very quiet. The lathe wasn't running. Outside there was some traffic on Merchant Street, distant and ordinary. He made me doubt my own perception, she said finally. That's what the gaslighting does. He was so consistent about the public version that by the time I overheard him with his brother, I'd already been trained to think the private version was... She stopped. I thought I was the problem. I thought I was reading things wrong. You weren't. I know that, intellectually. But knowing something intellectually and trusting it are different things. She looked down at her coffee. I spent a year second-guessing myself around him. That doesn't just turn off. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then... No, it doesn't. Again, that careful thing in his voice. She looked at him. You're talking from experience, she said. He didn't deny it. He picked up the flat tool again, looked at the webbing, set it back down. Claire was... He stopped. Tried again. She's a good person. We're good parents together. But there was a period in our marriage, before we figured out it wasn't working, where I kept feeling like... He paused, choosing the words with the same care he used for everything. Like I was doing everything wrong and I couldn't identify what or why. Like I was failing at something I couldn't see. Victoria was quiet. Took me a couple years after the divorce to trust my own read of things again, he said. To believe that what I was feeling was accurate, that it wasn't just me being difficult or misreading. How did you get there? He thought about it. Work, mostly. Being here. He gestured at the workshop with a slight movement. Stuff that needed me to trust my hands. After a while, the hands and the head catch up to each other. She looked at the Victorian chair on the workbench, at the rebuilt seat frame with its new webbing, at the cracked back leg that he'd pinned and clamped 3 days ago and was now holding firm. The bones are solid, she said quietly. He looked at her. You said that, the first week, about the chair. I remember. You were talking about the chair. Yeah, he said. He held her gaze for a second longer than was strictly necessary. I was. She looked away first, picked up her coffee. The workshop hummed quietly around them, and neither of them said anything else, and it was the kind of silence that meant more than it was supposed to. That was the week she started noticing him differently. Not as a sudden thing, not as a realization that arrived in a single moment with appropriate music. More like the way you notice the temperature has changed, gradually, then all at once, and you're not sure exactly when it happened. She noticed the specific way he held his focus when he was working something complicated, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed, how his hands moved with a patience she'd never managed in her own life. She noticed that he laughed with his whole face when something actually struck him funny, not the courteous performance of amusement that most people in professional settings offered. She noticed that he always made sure she had somewhere to sit, and that the coffee was hot, and that the workshop door wasn't so cold she couldn't stay long. Small, automatic things. The kind of consideration that didn't announce itself. She noticed that she was 41 days into being in Calder Creek, and she had not once in the past 2 weeks woken up at 3 in the morning reaching for someone who wasn't there. What she also noticed, and this one she sat with uncomfortably, was the way certain thoughts arrived when she wasn't guarding against them. Standing in her mother's bathroom mirror, which was the only mirror she'd allowed herself to use since coming home, she'd caught herself thinking about how Ethan had looked at her once. Just looked at her, with nothing calculated in it, nothing performing. And for about 30 seconds she hadn't felt like a person with damage to account for. Then the 30 seconds ended, and she'd looked at herself in the mirror, and the other thing came back, the inventory, the catalog of what was different. The scar below the waistline that she'd stopped touching directly, because the way it felt under her fingers still startled her. The parts of her body she'd stopped treating as continuous with herself. She'd put her clothes back on and gone downstairs and eaten breakfast, and said good morning to her mother and been completely fine. But she'd stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment first. Just a moment. The evening it came apart was a Thursday in the second week of December. She'd gone home from the workshop in the mid-afternoon, later than usual because Ethan had been in the middle of something complicated with the roll-top desk's mechanism, and she'd stayed to watch him work through a problem, a specific joint that kept binding, which he'd taken apart and reassembled 3 times before finding the tolerance issue. And when she got back to her mother's house, Eleanor was on the phone in the kitchen with a look on her face that meant someone was saying something she had to be careful about receiving. She poured herself water and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and tried not to listen. But the kitchen wasn't big, and Eleanor wasn't young enough to pitch her voice low. She's doing better, Eleanor said. She really is. I can see it. She's getting some color back. She's eating... A pause. I understand that. I know you're worried, but she needs time. Another pause. Longer. Yes. I'll tell her you called. Eleanor put the phone down on the counter and stood there for a moment with her back to the room. That was Margaret Langford, she said. Marcus's mother. Victoria's hands went still on her keyboard. She wanted to know how you were doing, Eleanor said carefully. She turned around. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was processing something on behalf of someone she loved, careful and angry simultaneously, like a person holding something hot. She said Marcus has been asking about you. The kitchen was quiet. He's been asking, Victoria said. That's what she said. The number of responses she could have given sat in her mouth in a line, and she did not give any of them because she was 30 years old and not a person who threw things. "Thank you for taking the call," she said. "Victoria, I need a minute." She went upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed, put her hands flat on her knees and looked at the wall. The same wall she'd looked at in this room at 17 and 21 and 26, during various crises of various sizes, and it occurred to her that the wall had absorbed an enormous amount of her life's worst moments, and had never said a word about it. The feeling that came up wasn't anger exactly. It was something older and less clean, a twisting thing, a pulling in two directions thing, because the truthful account of how Marcus made her feel was complicated in a way she didn't want it to be. Hating him would have been cleaner. Missing him would have been more coherent. What she actually felt was more like the particular grief of discovering that something you'd relied on was hollow all the way through. Not just the person, but your own judgment. The year she'd spent thinking he was safe. The certainty she'd felt. The specific quiet confidence of believing she was loved in a way that wouldn't qualify or measure. She'd been wrong. She'd been completely, comprehensively wrong. And now he was asking about her. And she didn't know if that meant guilt or regret or something else entirely, and she didn't want to know, and she was furious at herself for the small, awful, involuntary flicker of something that happened in her chest when her mother said the words. She was furious that it still did anything to her at all. She grabbed her coat and went out. She didn't plan to go to Ethan's workshop. It was past 5. The workshop was probably closed. She hadn't texted. She drove there anyway. The light was still on. She could see it through the window from half a block away, that specific amber warmth. She sat in the car for a full 3 minutes. Then she went in. I was cleaning the workbench. Not a project in progress, just the end-of-day tidying he did every evening, wiping down surfaces, organizing tools in a specific order she'd come to recognize as completely instinctive for him. He looked up when the door opened, read her face in approximately 2 seconds, and put down the cloth. "What happened?" he said. She opened her mouth, and the thing she was prepared to say, "Nothing. I just needed air. I was driving by," died somewhere in the space between intent and execution. "His mother called mine," she said instead. "Apparently Marcus has been asking about me." Ethan didn't say anything. He just waited. And the worst part, she stopped, pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum for a second. "The worst part is that I had a reaction when she told me. Just this tiny, completely involuntary." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, like some part of me is still hoping he meant something different than what he showed you, Ethan said. "Yes." The word came out with more force than she intended. "Which is insane. I know what he said. I know what he did. I was there. I watched him leave." She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back down. "But I also spent a year loving him. You can't just—" She stopped again. "No," Ethan said. "You can't." She stood in the middle of his workshop in her coat, her hands slightly unsteady, and felt the specific helplessness of being someone who understood their own wound perfectly and had no idea how to stop it from being a wound. "I hate this," she said quietly. "I know. I hate that he still has any—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He doesn't," Ethan said. He said it with the same flat accuracy he'd used on the porch that first night. "That feeling isn't him. That's just the shape that loving someone leaves in you for a while. It doesn't mean anything about him specifically. It'll go." She looked at him. "How long?" she asked. And she could hear in her own voice how much she needed an honest answer, not a kind one. Ethan thought about it. Actually thought about it. Didn't just reach for the reassuring thing. "Longer than you want," he said. "Less long than you're afraid of." She exhaled. It was such a specific answer. Such an Ethan answer. "That's the least comforting thing anyone could say," she said. "You asked for true, not comforting." "I know. They're not always the same. I know that too." She looked at him for a moment. He was standing at the workbench with his arms at his sides, his expression open in that rare private way it got sometimes. Not performing ease, just actually at ease. "You're annoyingly decent, you know that?" Something shifted in his face. "Not much. A slight thing. A movement around the eyes." "Annoyingly," he said. "Don't make it weird. You're the one who said it. I'm emotionally dysregulated. I get a pass." He almost smiled. Not quite. "You want to come eat something? I was going to lock up and go get dinner." "Nothing." He paused. "Just the diner. Lily's at Claire's tonight." She should have said no. She was recognizing with some clarity that the things she did in the direction of this man were adding up in a direction she hadn't fully cleared with herself yet. Yeah, she said. Okay. They went to the diner, which had the Christmas tinsel on the ceiling fans, and a waitress named Brenda, who had gone to high school with Ethan's mother, and therefore knew everything about everyone in the room within a range of 20 years. Brenda gave Victoria the look she'd been getting all month, the careful, warm, over-informed look of a person who'd heard several versions of her situation. And Victoria gave her the politely closed look she'd had 40 years of practice at. I'll have the patty melt, Victoria said, and coffee. Same, Ethan said, which surprised her because he was usually particular. Since when do you eat patty melts? She asked. Since always. You spent 20 minutes yesterday telling me that American cheese wasn't real cheese. Doesn't mean I don't eat it. She stared at him. That's completely hypocritical. It's human. That's what people say when they're being hypocritical. Victoria. What? Eat your patty melt. She ate her patty melt. It was extremely good, which she was not going to tell him. They talked through dinner in the way they talked, jumping between things, sometimes serious, sometimes not, with the ease she'd stopped noticing was unusual because it had become normal. He told her about Lily's latest school project, a diorama of a rainforest that had turned into a two-evening disaster because Lily had very specific opinions about the accuracy of the animals and had found the plastic jaguar they'd bought basically embarrassing. Victoria laughed, a real one. She researched the correct musculature of a jaguar at age 7. She found a documentary. He looked resigned and fond simultaneously. She has opinions about accuracy. She sounds terrifying. She is. She's also... He stopped, and the look on his face was something she'd seen only a couple of times, completely unguarded, the kind of expression that didn't know it was being observed. She's the best thing I've ever done. Victoria looked at him across the diner table with its red vinyl seats and its paper placements and the tinsel moving slightly on the fan above them, and felt something shift in her chest with a definite, recognizable weight. It wasn't the hollow feeling she'd been carrying for 5 months. It was something else, something that felt uncomfortably like the beginning of something real. She looked down at her coffee. She'd like you, Ethan said. Victoria looked up. She likes people who are direct, he said. She has no patience for... He made a vague gesture. Managed responses. She's my kind of person, Victoria said. I thought so. The tinsel moved. Brenda refilled their coffee without being asked. Outside on the main street, a group of kids in winter coats were walking past the diner window, and one of them was wearing a hat shaped like a penguin, and it was so specifically, so absurdly Calder Creek, that Victoria smiled at the window without meaning to. I haven't thought about the company once tonight, she said. She hadn't planned to say it either. She seemed to be losing control of what came out of her mouth around him. Good, he said. That's unprecedented. Since I was 23. Also good. I'm supposed to be figuring out whether I'm going back. Ethan was quiet for a moment. And? She looked at her coffee cup. I don't know yet. I thought I'd know by now, but She paused. I built that company from a conversation I had with a grad school professor and a $15,000 credit card balance. I worked on it every single day for 8 years. It's mine in a way that nothing else has ever been. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. But going back means everything there reminds me of everything after. The hospital, the apartment, She stopped. The version of myself I was trying to be for a person who'd already decided I wasn't worth it. The company isn't him, Ethan said. I know. What you built didn't change because he left. I know that too. She looked up. I just haven't figured out how to walk back into the place where it happened yet. He looked at her with that direct, clear attention that she'd never quite gotten used to. The quality of it, how it didn't flinch away or over-soften. You will, he said. Not you can. Not I think you might. Just you will. Present tense, already decided. She felt it in her chest again, that weighted thing, that beginning of something. She did not reach for it. Not yet. She was smarter than that, and she was also, if she was being completely honest with herself, more afraid than she'd admitted to anyone. But she held it for a moment, let herself feel the weight of it. Then she picked up her coffee and said something about Brenda's suspiciously thorough knowledge of everyone's business. And Ethan told her a story about the time Dale at the hardware store had announced his divorce before he told his own wife, and they laughed until the diner closed around them. She drove home through the December dark streets of Calder Creek with the heater going and her hands easy on the wheel, and the particular feeling of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has, just for one evening, put it down. She didn't put Marcus's mother's call in her head again that night. She put it in the drawer she'd been building, the one for things she knew but hadn't felt all the way through yet. And she went to sleep at 11:30 and woke up at 6:15 and lay in the thin winter light of her childhood bedroom and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not the same person who had driven into her mother's driveway 6 weeks ago in the rain. She was still wounded. She was still scarred in ways that hadn't been fully inventoried. She still had mirrors she avoided and feelings she didn't know what to do with. But she was not the same. And somewhere on Merchant Street, in a workshop that smelled like sawdust and linseed oil and old beautiful things being made new, a man who understood the value of solid bones was beginning to be someone she thought about more than she was entirely comfortable with. She sat with that, in the winter light of her childhood bedroom, and did not run from it. Not quite yet. The Victorian parlor chair was finished on a Monday. Victoria knew it was finished because she came into the workshop that morning, and it was sitting near the window where the light was best, positioned the way Ethan positioned finished pieces before a client pickup, centered, turned at a slight angle, the way things look when someone wants you to see them properly. The new upholstery was a deep charcoal velvet that the client had chosen, and the restored frame had been refinished in a dark walnut that was close enough to the original to be honest, but clean enough to show the repair clearly, which was a thing Ethan believed in, that restoration shouldn't pretend the damage hadn't happened, that good work made the repair part of the object's history rather than something to hide. She stood in front of it for a long moment. "It's the same chair," she said. Ethan came up beside her, coffee in hand. "Same chair." "It looks completely different." "Different isn't the same as new." He looked at it with the expression he got around finished pieces. Not pride exactly, more like the particular satisfaction of a problem fully solved. "Everything that's there now was there before. I just fixed what was broken and replaced what was actually gone." She looked at the chair. She looked at him. He was looking at the chair. "Stop doing," she said. "Doing what?" "Saying things that are about the furniture, but actually about me." He turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that was almost caught, a flicker of something real and slightly surprised, like he hadn't entirely realized he was doing it. "Occupational habit," he said finally. "It's transparent. It's genuine." They stood next to each other in the morning light and looked at the finished chair, and neither of them said anything for a little while, and the workshop held the silence the way it always did, without pressure, without demand. That was the week Lily came to the workshop for the first time while Victoria was there. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with Claire, Ethan's ex-wife, who turned out to be exactly as Josie had described, a tall, composed woman with an easy directness about her and zero apparent interest in performing any kind of complicated emotional territory. Claire dropped Lily at the workshop door the way you drop a child somewhere completely familiar to them, with a quick exchange of information about pickup times and a brief nod in Victoria's direction that was neither warm nor cold, just observant. "Lily, say hi," Ethan said. Lily Carter was 7 years old and small for it, with Claire's light coloring and Ethan's dark eyes, and she had the particular self-possession of a child who had been treated like her opinions were worth hearing. She looked at Victoria with an assessment that was startlingly direct. "Are you the one who comes every day?" Lily asked. Victoria blinked. "Mostly." "Dad said you built a company." "I did." Lily considered this with the gravity of someone filing important information. "What kind?" "Data infrastructure, software that helps other companies manage their information." Lily's expression was politely unconvinced. "Is that interesting?" "It was very interesting to me." "Dad says interesting is personal," Lily said, which was such a complete encapsulation of something Ethan would say that Victoria had to work to keep her expression even. "Do you know what this is?" Lily pointed to the roll-top desk, which was now nearly finished. The tambour mechanism working cleanly, the surface restored. "It's a roll-top desk, probably made around 1910, give or take." Lily's expression shifted, the polite, unconvinced look replaced by something more engaged. "How do you know?" "The style of the hardware, the type of wood, the way the timbre is built." Victoria nodded at the desk. "Your dad taught me that part." Lily looked at her father, then back at Victoria. Then she went and sat at the little stool in the corner that was clearly her designated spot in the workshop, worn smooth, a small basket of things beside it, and opened a book that appeared to be about South American mammals, and the conversation was apparently over. Ethan caught Victoria's eye over Lily's head. His expression was careful and completely readable to her now. 7 weeks in, she'd developed a working vocabulary for his face, and it said, "Don't make it a thing." She didn't make it a thing. She went back to her stool and her laptop and worked on the quarterly board letter while the workshop ran its familiar afternoon rhythms around her. At some point, Lily came over and stood next to Victoria's stool and looked at her screen. "What's that?" Lily asked. "A letter to the people who invested money in my company." "Is it good?" "The letter or the update?" Lily shrugged in the way that meant both. "The letter is fine. The update is very good, actually." Victoria looked at the screen. "The company has been doing well even while I've been away." "Does that make you happy or sad?" She opened her mouth and then stopped. The actual answer was complicated. It made her feel something that was equal parts relief and a specific, uncomfortable irrelevance. A confirmation that the thing she'd built was bigger than her presence in it, which was professionally excellent and personally something she hadn't fully sorted. "Both a little," she said. Lily accepted this with the nod of someone who understood that things could be two contradictory things simultaneously, which was more emotional sophistication than most adults managed. "My Jaguar's done," Lily told her. The diorama one. My dad helped me make a new one out of clay." "Is it accurate?" Lily's face did something satisfied and decisive. "Yes." After Claire picked her up that evening, Ethan stood by the window watching the car pull away and then turned back to the workbench. He had the particular expression of a parent watching a child leave, the way the face holds something back in. "She liked you," he said. "It wasn't a question. She was evaluating me. That's how she likes people. She evaluates first. She's 7. She's been 7 for a while now." He picked up the cloth he'd been using. "She asked me once if you were my friend. I said yes." Victoria kept her face neutral. "What'd she say?" "She said you didn't seem like someone who needed a lot of friends. She meant it as a compliment." "She's your daughter." "Is that good or bad?" Victoria looked at him, at his face, which was doing the slightly reluctant thing it did when something mattered to him more than he was prepared to show, and felt the weight in her chest again. The beginning of something weight. "Good," she said. "It's good." She meant it more than it sounded. The night it changed was a Thursday, December 19th, 6 days before Christmas. Victoria had been at the workshop later than usual. Ethan had been installing the tambour mechanism into the roll-top desk for what he estimated was the last time, which had turned into a longer process than either of them planned because the mechanism kept binding in a specific spot that resisted every adjustment he tried, and Victoria had positioned herself at an angle where she could see the problem area and started troubleshooting it with him the way she troubleshot engineering problems at Hale Logic, systematically, without ego, calling out what she saw. "The left guide rail," she said. "It's fractionally lower than the right." He looked, measured. He didn't say anything, just reset the rail and tried the mechanism again. It ran clean. He straightened up, looked at her. "You have got to be kidding me," he said. "You had it set by eye. You needed a second reference point." "I've been working on that for 4 hours. 4 hours and 30 seconds, if you count me." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Thank you," he said, with the slightly ungracious delivery of a person who genuinely meant it, but didn't love needing to say it. She felt something warm and slightly gleeful about that. "Any time." It was past 7 by the time he locked the workshop. Lily was with Claire through the holidays, and he'd mentioned earlier that the house was quiet in the way it got when she was gone. Not bad quiet, he'd said, just the specific quality of absence that didn't fully lift until she was back. He said it in a voice that didn't ask for anything, but Victoria heard what was underneath it. "Come eat," she said. "Mom made too much food again. She always makes too much." "You don't have to—" "Ethan," she looked at him. "Come eat." Eleanor received him with the warm, controlled pleasure of a woman who had won something she was being polite about. She set a third plate without comment, made easy conversation about the town's Christmas events, refilled glasses before they were empty, and did not once give Victoria the specific look Victoria had told her not to give. It was a good dinner, a real one, the kind that went longer than it was supposed to because the conversation kept finding another place to go. Ethan and Eleanor talked about his grandfather's workshop, about old furniture she'd inherited from her own mother, about the roll-top desk that was now finished, and the Victorian chair that had already been picked up by its owner, who had apparently stood in the workshop for several minutes saying nothing and then started crying, which Ethan reported with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who could handle most things, but weeping clients was a category he was still developing a response for. "What did you do?" Victoria asked. "I got her a glass of water." "You got her a glass of water." It seemed practical. "She was moved by something you made. You got her a glass of water." "She needed to sit down. I got her a chair and a glass of water." "That is—" She stopped, shook her head. "That is so specifically you." "Is that bad?" "It's accurate." Eleanor looked between them with the expression of someone watching something and being absolutely right about what it was, and said nothing, and Victoria appreciated the restraint enormously. After dinner, Eleanor said she had a phone call to make, a claim Victoria was 40% sure was invented, and disappeared upstairs, and Ethan helped Victoria clear the dishes in the way you help clear dishes when you're comfortable in someone's house. Comfortable enough to know where things went, comfortable enough to not ask. They moved around Eleanor's small kitchen in an easy geometry, trading dishes and space, and at some point they were both at the counter, and there was less room than strictly necessary, and neither of them moved. Victoria was looking at the dish towel in her hands. "Hey," Ethan said. She looked up. He was close. The kitchen was small and they'd been working in it for 20 minutes, but this was a different proximity, the kind you arrive at by accretion. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes." Then, because she was tired of that automatic answer, mostly, he waited. "I had a session with my therapist this afternoon," she said, "before I came to the workshop, video call." She looked at the dish towel again. "She asked me whether I'd thought about what I was afraid of, specifically." She folded the towel, unfolded it. "I told her I was afraid of going back to San Francisco. She said that wasn't the specific thing. She asked me again." The kitchen was quiet. The heater ticked. "What did you say?" Ethan asked. "I said I was afraid of letting someone close and having them look at me the way Marcus did." She put the dish towel on the counter. "Having them look at me like I was—" She stopped. "Like the damage was a deal breaker they were too kind to say out loud." He was looking at her. She could feel it without meeting his eyes. "She asked me if that was happening," Victoria continued. "Right now, in my life, currently." She stopped again, let out a breath. "I didn't know how to answer." The house was very quiet. Ethan put the glass he was holding down on the counter. He didn't reach for her, didn't step closer, didn't do anything except stay exactly where he was. "It's not," he said. 2 words, flat and certain. "You don't know what I look like," she said. Her voice came out lower than she intended. Not all of it. The surgery changed things, and—" She stopped. Her hands had gone slightly unsteady, and she hated that, hated the helplessness of it. "I've been hiding it. The way I dress, the way I move. I've been hiding it since it happened, because the one time I didn't—" She pressed her lips together. "The one time I trusted someone with it, they decided I wasn't worth staying for." Ethan was quiet. "So I don't know," she said, "what you'd think, if you actually saw it. I don't know if I'm afraid that you'd react the way he did, or if I'm afraid that you wouldn't, and then I'd have to—" She stopped, exhaled. "That I'd have to deal with whatever came after." The kitchen held the silence for a moment. "Okay," Ethan said. His voice was even. "Do you want me to know?" She looked at him. "Not as a test," he said. "Not to prove something. Just—" He looked at her steadily. "Do you want to not be hiding it anymore? From me?" Her throat was tight. "I don't know." "That's an honest answer." She looked at him for a long moment. At his face, which was the most reliable thing she'd seen in months. Not because it was always easy or always kind, but because it was always true. There was nothing performed in it. No careful management, no practiced warmth. He just looked at her. She turned and left the kitchen. He didn't follow, which was right. She needed a minute, and he understood that without being told. And she climbed the stairs to her room and stood with her back against the closed door for a moment and breathed. Her therapist had said something in their session that afternoon that Victoria had been turning over since. The risk of being seen isn't in what someone else does with it. The risk is in what you decide it means before they have the chance to do anything at all. She'd argued against that in the session. She'd said that was fine in theory, but her empirical evidence suggested otherwise. Her therapist had said, "One data point isn't a pattern, Victoria. It's an event." She stood against her bedroom door. Then she went to her dresser, and she looked at herself in the small mirror above it. the narrow one, the only mirror in this room she'd allowed, and she said to herself in the quietest possible internal voice that she was going to do the thing that terrified her, not because it was safe, because she was tired of letting one person's failure of courage become the boundary of what she was willing to risk. She changed into a softer top. She went back downstairs. Ethan was where she'd left him, leaning against the counter, giving her whatever time she needed, not filling the space with reassurance or questions. She stopped in the middle of the kitchen. "I'm going to show you," she said, "because I need to know. And because—" she paused. "Because I trust you. And that terrifies me, and I'm going to do it anyway." He straightened slightly. His face was very still. She pulled the hem of her top up on one side, just the left side, just enough, and showed him the scar below her waist. Not dramatic, not catastrophically disfiguring. She knew, objectively, that it wasn't. But it was there, and it was real, and it was the thing she had not let anyone see in 6 months, and the thing Marcus's expression had changed over, and the thing she'd been covering up with oversized clothes and careful positioning and an enormous amount of exhausting vigilance. She watched Ethan's face. He looked. Only briefly, just long enough to actually see it, to not be someone who looked away. And then his eyes came up to her face. She was waiting. She was waiting for the management, the performance of acceptance, the careful, practiced warmth of a man working hard to react correctly. His face was none of those things. He looked at her the same way he'd been looking at her for 8 weeks, like she was the thing he was actually here for. "I want you," he said. It was quiet, completely unlayered. 3 words with no architecture around them, no qualifying, no performing. "Not the Forbes version," he continued, his voice even. "Not the put-together version that showed up in my driveway in the rain." He looked at her. "You. The one who's been fighting to feel like herself again for 6 months. That's the one I want." Her eyes had filled. She hadn't known until it was already happening. She blinked once. "Ethan," her voice was unsteady. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I'm not saying it to get something. I'm saying it because you needed to hear a true thing, and that's the true thing." The kitchen was very quiet. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, not performing distress, just managing the simple physical fact of it. And then she let her hand fall and looked at him and did not try to keep any of it off her face. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I don't know how to trust it. I want to, and I don't know how." "I know," he said. "I'm going to be terrible at it. I'm going to second-guess it and overcorrect and push back on things I shouldn't." "I know that too." "You say that like it's fine. It's not fine, it's just true." He looked at her. "I'm not easy either. I work too much and I go quiet when things get hard. And my ex-wife would tell you I am sometimes the most frustrating person she's ever tried to reach." "I'm not asking your ex-wife. I'm telling you myself. I've got things that don't work right either." He paused. "I'm not offering you something easy. I'm just telling you it's real." She looked at him across the kitchen of her mother's house with its worn linoleum and its family photos on the wall and its smell of whatever Eleanor had cooked for dinner and the faint ticking of the heater, and she felt the thing she'd been bracing against for weeks land in her chest with its full weight. It was terrifying. It was also unmistakable. She crossed the kitchen and he opened his arms and she walked into them and he held her, properly, fully, without reserve, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and just stood there, while the particular sustained grief of 5 months of performing okayness finally had somewhere to put itself. She didn't sob. It wasn't dramatic. It was just the kind of crying that happens when you've been holding something so long your arms have gone numb and you finally let it down. He didn't say anything. He didn't rub her back in the rote, slightly uncomfortable way of someone who didn't know what else to do. He just held her, steady and even. After a while she pulled back. She was slightly embarrassed in the way she always was after real emotion, the residual privacy instinct that tried to turn it into a performance review. "I look terrible," she said. "You look like someone who's been carrying too much for too long." "That's the same thing. It really isn't." He looked at her face, without assessment, without the careful management of someone who needed her to be okay. Just looked. "You want coffee? It's late, but—" "Yes." She almost laughed. "Yes, make the coffee." He turned to the cabinet. She stayed at the counter and watched him move through her mother's kitchen with the ease of someone who'd been there a handful of times, but paid attention, finding the coffee on the first try, knowing which burner ran hot, giving her space and proximity in the right proportions. "Ethan," she said. He turned. "I'm not ready to—" She stopped. "I mean, whatever this is. I'm not ready to call it something or put a shape on it. I need it to be just this for a while, whatever this is." "Okay," he said. "That's genuinely okay with you?" "You told me the truth," he said. "That's where everything real starts. The rest of it—" He turned back to the coffee. "The rest of it can go at the speed it goes." She watched him for a moment. "Do you ever disagree with anything I say?" she asked. He thought about it. "The German chisels," he said. She laughed. A real one, startled out of her, and it broke the last of the tension in her chest like a window being opened. He turned around at the sound of it, and she saw it again. The way his face opened when she laughed. The involuntary thing. The thing that wasn't performance. She looked at him in her mother's kitchen, in the yellow light, over coffee that hadn't brewed yet. She thought, this is what it feels like when it's real. Not perfect. Not resolved. Not without the scar still tender under her clothes, and the fear still living in her nervous system, and the work of learning to trust something again after trust had been quietly demolished. But real. They drank the coffee at the kitchen table, Eleanor's chair conspicuously empty, and talked until the house was fully quiet around them. About Lily's Christmas list, about the workshop's January schedule, about the board letter Victoria had been rewriting for 2 weeks, and finally sent that afternoon because it was either send it or acknowledge she was hiding in Calder Creek indefinitely. "When do you have to go back?" Ethan asked. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "January, probably. There's a board meeting the second week." He nodded. "I'll come back," she said. She hadn't planned to say that, but she realized, absolutely meant it. He looked at her with that level, clear attention. "I know," he said. She didn't ask him how he knew. She didn't push on it. She let it be exactly what it was, a thing said and heard and believed. Not because it was guaranteed, but because both of them were tired of qualifying everything down to nothing. He left at 11:30. She walked him to the door, and he stopped on the porch steps and turned back. "Victoria," he said. She was holding the door frame. "Yeah, thank you, for tonight." He said it plainly, without dressing it up. "For trusting me with that." Her chest did something complicated, and she pressed her mouth together once before she answered. "Don't make me regret it," she said. He almost smiled. "I'm going to try real hard not to." She stood in the open door and watched him get in the truck and back out of the driveway, and she stayed there until his taillights turned the corner. Behind her in the house, she heard her mother's bedroom door open with the specific creak it had always had, and Eleanor's voice float down from the top of the stairs, deliberately casual. "Is he gone?" "Go back to bed, Mom." "I was just asking." "You were absolutely not just asking." A pause. Then, in the warmest, most precisely timed possible voice, "Good night, sweetheart." Victoria closed the front door. She stood in the entry hall and looked at nothing in particular and felt not healed, not fixed, not some easy, triumphant version of herself standing on the other side of something difficult. She was still scarred. She was still afraid. She still had a board meeting in January and a city to return to, and a version of herself to rebuild that was honest about what she'd been through. But she was standing in her mother's house at 11:30 at night, and someone had looked at the part she'd been hiding and hadn't flinched, and she had cried in a man's arms without shame for the first time in 6 months. She went upstairs. She brushed her teeth. She looked at her reflection in the narrow mirror. Actually looked, for longer than she usually allowed herself. She looked tired. Her eyes were slightly swollen. Her hair was a disaster. She looked, she thought, like herself. She turned off the bathroom light and went to bed and slept 8 hours straight, which was, by a significant margin, the best night's sleep she'd had since February. She didn't dream about anything she could remember in the morning. In the workshop on Merchant Street, the finished roll-top desk sat near the window where the light was best, its mechanism running clean and quiet, its restored surface honest about every repair it carried, the marks of damage and the marks of work, both of them part of the same object, both of them what made it worth keeping. She didn't tell anyone what had happened in the kitchen that night, not Josie, who called on Saturday and asked approximately 9 questions in the space of 4 minutes, while claiming she was just checking in. Not Eleanor, who had the diplomatic restraint to say nothing but whose eyes carried a permanent soft question whenever Victoria came downstairs in the morning. Not her therapist, who had 60 minutes of Victoria's time the following Tuesday, and who Victoria spent most of those 60 minutes telling about the board letter and the January trip back to San Francisco, and other things that were real but were not the most real thing. She needed to hold it privately for a while. Not because she was ashamed of it or uncertain of it. She was both of those things too, but that wasn't the main reason. The main reason was that the moment it became a story she told other people, it would become something they had opinions about and questions about and investment in, and right now it was just hers. Hers and Ethan's. Something that had happened in her mother's kitchen, over bad coffee, quiet and unmistakable, and she needed to live inside it for a few days before anyone else's words got near it. What changed in the days after was small and specific. She stopped wearing the oversized sweatshirts to the workshop. Not dramatically. She didn't walk in wearing something fitted and significant, waiting for a reaction. She just wore a regular sweater. Dark green, slightly worn at the elbows from actual use rather than manufactured distressing. Something that fit the shape of her without requiring her to disappear inside it. Ethan noticed. She knew he noticed because of the way he very deliberately didn't mention it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The same way he'd handled most of the things that mattered between them. He just looked at her when she came in, the same way he always looked at her, and said good morning, and handed her the extra coffee she hadn't asked for, and went back to what he was working on. She set her bag down on the stool and felt the specific relief of a person who has been braced for something that didn't come. New project? She asked, looking at the workbench. There was something new there, a piece she hadn't seen before, smaller than most of his usual work. A wooden jewelry box, the kind with a hinged lid, the veneer lifting at the corners and one of the hinges missing entirely. Client dropped it off yesterday, he said. Her grandmother's. She doesn't want it restored to look new. She just wants it to work again. Victoria looked at it. The veneer's lifting pretty badly on the front panel. I can stabilize it without replacing it. Won't it show? That's the point. He picked it up carefully and showed her the corner where the veneer had curled away from the substrate. You press it back and consolidate the adhesive underneath and it holds. You'll be able to see where it lifted, but it'll be part of it. He set it back down. She said her grandmother used it every single day for 40 years. The where is the history. Victoria looked at the box for a moment. You said something like that once before, she said, about the chair. I say it a lot. He picked up his brush. It's true a lot. She watched him work. I wore a real sweater today, she said. Not announcing it, just saying it plainly, the way she was learning to say things to him. He looked up briefly. I saw. How is it? He considered her with a completely even expression. How's what? Don't be deliberately obtuse. You look like yourself, he said. That's how it is. She pressed her lips together against something and turned back to her laptop. It was not a grand moment. There was no swelling realization or decisive shift. She just sat on her stool in her regular sweater and worked on the January board presentation while he stabilized the veneer on an old jewelry box, and the workshop was warm and smelled the way it always smelled. And outside on Merchant Street, the December traffic moved at its unhurried Calder Creek pace. Small, real, hers. Christmas came at them the way it always did in a family house, with too much food and specific traditions that had survived long enough to feel non-negotiable, and the particular texture of a holiday that was both comfortable and slightly loaded, because comfort and loaded things tended to coexist at this time of year, whether you wanted them to or not. Eleanor made the same meal she'd made every Christmas for 30 years, which included a sweet potato casserole that was technically a dessert in protein form, and a green bean dish that required 3 hours of work and tasted, Victoria had always thought, like the idea of green beans rather than actual green beans, but which Eleanor defended fiercely, and Victoria had learned not to argue about. Ethan came for Christmas dinner. This had been Eleanor's invitation, extended through Victoria with a casualness that was not casual at all, and Victoria had relayed it to Ethan with an expression that dared him to make it complicated. She invited me, or you invited me through her? He asked. She invited you. I facilitated. There's a difference. There is, and you should come anyway. He came. He brought a bottle of wine that was better than anything Victoria had expected him to pick, which she mentioned, and he said Josie had texted him a recommendation, which was the most honest possible answer and also slightly deflating. Lily was with Claire for Christmas Day itself, which meant Ethan arrived with the particular quietness of a parent whose child was somewhere else on a significant day. Victoria noticed it. The way he was present and warm and genuinely good company through dinner, and also slightly elsewhere. Not moody, not difficult, just carrying something, the way parents carried certain days. After dinner, when Eleanor had retreated to the living room with her book, and the particular contentment of a woman who had produced a successful meal and could now rest, Victoria and Ethan ended up on the back porch with the wine and the cold air. The yard was dark except for the string of lights Eleanor had put along the fence, the same lights she'd put along the same fence every Christmas for 20 years, replaced bulb by bulb, so they were technically not the same lights at all, but felt like they were. "You miss her," Victoria said. She didn't mean it as a question. "Yeah." He looked at the yard. "She called this morning. She'd already opened most of her presents." He paused. "She got a book on big cats. She called me to read the Jaguar section out loud." Victoria felt something in her chest that she didn't immediately know the name for. "She called you to read it to you," she said. "She wanted me to know it first, before she told anyone else." His voice was quiet and level. "She does that. She finds things she likes, and she calls me." Victoria looked at the string lights on the fence. She thought about what it meant to be the person someone called first. To have built something in a small life, a workshop, a routine, a 7-year-old who called her father to read Jaguar facts over the phone on Christmas morning. That was genuinely worth having. She had $340 million on paper and a company that was running fine without her. She had never once had someone call her first thing in the morning because they'd found something they liked. "She's lucky," Victoria said. "I'm the lucky one." He said it without performance, just the plain statement of a man who knew what he had. She looked at him in the back porch light. "Ethan," she said. He turned. She didn't know what she wanted to say. She had several things in the vicinity of what she wanted to say, and none of them were fully formed. She was also, she recognized, slightly afraid. Not of him, not anymore, but of the thing that saying any of it out loud would make real. "I've been thinking about January," she said, which was the true thing and also the deflection. He waited. "The board meeting is the 9th. I'd need to be there by the 7th to prep." She looked at her wine glass. San Francisco, the apartment, the office, all of it. She stopped. "I keep trying to picture walking back into the building and I can, and then I can't, and then I can again. What does the can version feel like?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I built something worth walking back into." She paused. "What does the can't version feel like?" "Like every hallway has a version of Marcus in it." She looked at him. "That's accurate." "Which version is real?" "Both of them." She turned the wine glass in her hands. "That's what my therapist keeps telling me. That both things can be true, and I have to go back anyway and find out which one is bigger." "She sounds right." "She usually is. It's annoying." He almost smiled. "What happens after the board meeting?" "I don't know." She looked at the string lights. "I told Denise I'd do a full re-engagement in February. Back full time, the whole thing." She paused. "But I keep—" She stopped. "You keep what?" She turned to look at him directly. "I keep thinking about this. Here, the workshop and my mother's house and—" She stopped again, let out a breath. "I have a company worth close to $1 billion, and the thing I've been thinking about most lately is whether I can move the quarterly board calls to Thursday afternoon so I can be here through the week." He was very still. "I'm not saying that as—" She shook her head. "I'm not putting anything on you. I'm just telling you what's actually in my head because you asked, and I told you I'd be honest." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "Can you run it from here?" he asked. "The company. Not as a compromise, actually. Denise basically runs it. I set direction and manage the board and make the big calls." She considered it seriously, not defensively. "I'd need to be in San Francisco 6, maybe 8 times a year. The rest of it—" She paused. "I've been running it remotely for 3 months, and the Q4 numbers are better than Q4 last year." So the answer is yes. The answer is possibly yes. She looked at him. "But I'm not making decisions about my life around something that's been—" She gestured between them. 2 weeks of something real. That's not how I operate. I know. I've made exactly one major life decision based on emotion, and it ended with me on this porch." "Your mother's back porch," he said, "which is where you're describing possibly wanting to be." He paused. "I don't think that logic is working the way you meant it to." She stared at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who was aware he'd made a good point and was attempting to be neutral about it. That's infuriating, she said. I know. She looked at the yard. He looked at the yard. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight, he said. I'm not asking you to decide anything at all. I'm just... He stopped, tried again. I think you should go back in January and do the board meeting and walk through the building and see what's still yours, because it is still yours. And then you should make the decision from there. And this? She gestured between them again. While I'm doing that? Still here, he said. Simple. Not promising perfection, not making guarantees about the future he couldn't actually see. Just still here. Present tense. Already decided. She picked up her wine glass. Merry Christmas, Carter, she said. Merry Christmas, Hale. They sat on the porch until it got too cold and then went inside and sat in Eleanor's living room while she read her book. The three of them quiet and warm in the particular way of people who didn't need to fill the room with noise. Victoria thought, this is what I came back to Calder Creek to find. I didn't know that's what I was looking for, but this is it. She didn't say it out loud. She put it in the drawer. The internal one she'd been building all fall. The one for things she knew were true, but needed time to fully become real. January arrived with the compressed speed of something she'd been putting off. She'd been dreading it with a specific and slightly embarrassing level of dread, but she'd also, in the last 2 weeks of December, started doing the thing her therapist called re-entry preparation, which was a clinical phrase for what was essentially getting used to the idea that San Francisco was still a real place that existed. She booked her flight on January 3rd. She told her mother, who said all the right things and then started talking very quickly about the guest room and making sure it stayed ready, which was Eleanor's way of managing emotion, movement, practicality, the keeping of rooms. She told Ethan the night she booked it. They were at the workshop, late. The way they often ended up at the workshop late now, her on the stool, him at the bench, the hours passing in the comfortable way they passed when neither of them was tracking them. She showed him the confirmation email on her phone, screen turned so he could see the date. January 7th, he said, back by the 12th, 13th at the latest. She pocketed the phone. Depending on how the board meeting goes. He nodded. Then, you going to be okay in the apartment? She'd told him about the apartment, the Pacific Heights penthouse, with its bay view and its beautiful light that she hadn't been back to since leaving in September. Her assistant had been maintaining it in her absence. Mail, utilities, the specific and slightly absurd maintenance schedule that came with a property that cost what it cost. I honestly don't know, she said. It was mine before it was ours. I signed the lease before Marcus and I got together, so technically it's never not been mine. She paused. But he was there for 2 years, and certain rooms still feel... You don't have to stay there, Ethan said. There are hotels. I know. She looked at her hands. But running from the apartment is the same as running from the building. I need to find out what size the room actually is, not what size it is in my head. I was quiet for a moment. Then, text me when you land. It was such a specific, plain request. No performance in it. No dramatic framing. Just text me when you land. The kind of thing people said when they wanted to know you'd arrived safely and didn't need to make it into more than that. Okay, she said. She landed at SFO on a Tuesday afternoon in a cold coastal fog that was so familiar it was almost disorienting. That specific San Francisco gray, so different from North Carolina's winter, the air-carrying ocean and concrete and the particular ambient quality of a city that was always performing its own urgency. She texted him from the rideshare. Landed. Fog. Very San Francisco. His response came 3 minutes later. Good. Sleep before the building. She put the phone in her pocket and looked out the window at the bay, gray-green and enormous under the overcast sky, and felt the city doing what it did. Pulling at her with both hands, familiar and slightly overwhelming, the way beloved difficult things pulled. The apartment was cold from inactivity. Her assistant had turned the heat up before her arrival, but it took the specific chill of an uninhabited space a few hours to fully leave. She stood in the entry hall for a moment, the marble floor, the high ceilings, the view of the bay visible through the living room windows, and did the inventory her therapist had suggested, real, present, accurate. This was her apartment. She had chosen it at 27. She had loved living here. The view was still the view. The rooms were still the rooms. She walked through each one. Kitchen, living room, the office she'd worked in for 3 years, the bedroom last, which she stood in the doorway of for slightly longer than the others. It was just a room. His absence was in it, yes. The particular shape of a presence that was no longer there. But it was quieter than she'd expected, less violent, more like an old argument you'd been dreading rereading that turned out, on the page, to be smaller than it had lived in memory. She texted Ethan from the bedroom doorway. "Apartment is fine, smaller than I remembered somehow," he replied 20 minutes later. He was probably in the workshop, phone not always immediately accessible. Things usually are. She slept in her own bed, in her own apartment, and it was uncomfortable and then it wasn't, and she woke up at 6:15 with the bay light coming in gray and familiar through the curtains, and she lay there for a moment and took stock. She was okay. Not fine in the automatic way. Actually, okay. She called Ethan at 7, which was 9 in North Carolina. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was already in the workshop. "How is it?" he asked. "I slept fine." She looked at the ceiling. "I had a moment in the bedroom last night, but it passed." "Good." "The view is still incredible," she said. "I forgot how good the view was." A pause, and then he said, with the particular dry economy of a man who is choosing to find something funny, 3 months in Calder Creek, and you forgot about a bay view. Don't read into that. I'm not reading anything. I'm noting. Those are the same thing." "They are not." She laughed, and it came out real and easy, the way her laughs had been coming out more often lately. The sound of it in the cold apartment felt like bringing something from one place into another, like proof that a thing could travel. "I have breakfast with Denise in an hour," she said. "And then the building. Text me after." "You're going to be working." "I'll look at my phone." She held that for a second. "Okay," she said. "After." Denise was, as she had been for 4 years, completely excellent. She met Victoria at a cafe 2 blocks from the Hale Logic office, neutral ground, which Victoria appreciated, and over breakfast delivered a company update that was both thorough and careful, the kind of briefing that gave Victoria everything she needed to walk into a board meeting and nothing she didn't. Denise had always had the specific skill of presenting information without editorializing about what it meant for Victoria personally. She did it again now. She also, at the end of breakfast, said, "You look different." "Different how?" Victoria asked. "Less?" Denise paused, and being Denise, she was actually searching for the accurate word rather than the diplomatic one. "Less like you're managing something you're not telling anyone about." Victoria looked at her coffee. "I'm still managing plenty of things I'm not telling anyone about," she said. "Sure." Denise picked up her bag. "But it's not in your face the same way it was in September." She stood. "The team is ready for you. They've missed you, if that's useful to hear." "It is," Victoria said, and meant it. The Hale Logic building was 12 stories of glass and concrete in Soema, and she'd stood in front of it maybe 1,000 times in 8 years, and it had always had the specific quality of something she'd built, a pride that was structural, that lived in her bones. She stood in front of it on a Tuesday morning in January and took a breath. The lobby guard, a man named Frank, who had been there since the company moved into the building, saw her through the glass and visibly recalibrated, and then waved with a warmth that was not professional obligation. She went through the doors. The lobby smelled the same. Coffee from the ground floor cafe, something faintly clean and industrial, the specific ambient sound of a building full of people doing focused work. The elevator had the same slight hesitation on the 6th floor it had always had. Her office was on the 10th, and she took the stairs the last 4 flights the way she always had, the way she had every day for 3 years. And by the 8th floor landing, something in her was already settling. This was hers, not Marcus's. Not the ghost of the hospital, or the ring she'd given back, or the careful voice on the other side of a kitchen table. This was hers from the beginning, and it was still hers, and it had been running fine without her, which meant she'd built it right. And she pushed open the stairwell door on the 10th floor and walked into the hallway, and Denise's assistant saw her and said, "Ms. Hale, welcome back," in a tone that was trying to be professional and mostly succeeding. She stood in her office. The view from the 10th floor was different from the penthouse. Lower, more urban, the bay a strip of gray-silver between buildings, rather than the full spread from height. She liked it better, actually. The city at working level, the thing she'd come here to do. She texted Ethan. "In the building, still mine." His response came faster this time. "I know." She stared at those 2 words for a moment. She thought about him in the workshop, saying "I know" in the same even voice he used for most certain things. Not reassurance, not performance. Just, "I know." She put the phone in her pocket and sat down at her desk and started working. The board meeting on the 9th was everything she'd been running it in her head, and then several things she hadn't. The 3 weeks of prep had been thorough enough that she moved through the agenda with the ease of long practice. And there was a specific moment in the second hour when the board's questions shifted from the careful, slightly managing quality they'd had at the start to the sharper, collaborative engagement that meant they believed she was fully present. And she felt the click of it, felt herself land back in the room she'd been building for 8 years. After, one of the board members, a venture capitalist named Howard Park, who had been with her since the Series A, and who had the particular quality of directness that came from 20 years of making expensive decisions, caught her in the hallway. "You're back," he said. "I've been running things from—" "That's not what I mean." He looked at her with the observational precision she'd always respected in him. "You've been gone since the surgery. Running things, yes, but not back." He paused. "You're back now." She held his gaze. "Working on it," she said. He nodded once and moved on, which was the right response. And she stood in the hallway of her own company and felt both things simultaneously. The pride of the thing she'd built, and the awareness of everything it had cost, and the very new, slightly unsteady sense that both of those things could be true, and she could still be here. She went back to the apartment that night and video called Ethan from the living room with the bay view behind her. "I was in the workshop." She could see the bench behind him, something covered in a moving blanket. A new project. She didn't recognize it yet. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Good." She paused. "Actually good, not performed good." "What's the difference?" "When it's performed, I can feel myself doing it. When it's real, I forget I'm doing anything." She leaned back on the couch. Today felt real. He looked at her through the screen, and she'd gotten good at reading him through screens, had developed a second vocabulary for it over the past 3 weeks of calls and texts that she hadn't entirely admitted to herself were as important to her day as they'd become. "Lily made something for you," he said. She blinked. "For me?" "She made a clay jaguar, the accurate one." He reached off screen and came back with a small clay figure, rough-shaped, clearly hand-formed, but with a specific attention to the musculature that was, for a 7-year-old, genuinely impressive. "She said to tell you she looked up the South American subspecies. This one's an Amazonian jaguar." Victoria looked at the small clay jaguar in his hand. She pressed her lips together once. "Tell her it's perfect," she said. "I'll tell her you said that." He set it back down somewhere off screen with the careful deliberateness of a person handling something that mattered. "When do you fly back?" "Thursday." "What time?" "4:30. Gets in at 11 something." "I'll pick you up," he said. She opened her mouth. "You don't have to—" "Victoria. It's late." "It's 11. "Ethan, I'll be at arrivals," he said, in the tone that meant the conversation was over. "Text me the flight number." She looked at him through the screen, at his face in the workshop light, steady and familiar, the new project behind him under its blanket, sawdust on his jacket. "You're going to argue with me about the chisels again when I get back," she said. "Probably." "I'm right about the chisels." "You're right about a lot of things," he said, which was a more significant concession than it sounded. "The chisels aren't one of them." She laughed. She flew back on Thursday night, landed at the regional airport just past 11, and walked through the arrivals gate in her coat with her carry-on, tired in the specific way of someone who has done a necessary hard thing and is ready to be home. He was there, leaning against the wall outside arrivals in his jacket, hands in his pockets, with the particular quality of someone who had been waiting without becoming impatient with the wait. He saw her and straightened, and his face did the thing it did. The slight opening, the involuntary thing. She walked toward him, and when she reached him, she just stopped. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. She was tired, and her feet hurt, and her hair was doing something she couldn't fix in an airport bathroom, and she was standing in an arrivals hall in Calder Creek Regional Airport at 11:15 at night, looking at a man who had driven here at this hour because he'd said he would. "I'm glad you're here," she said. He looked at her. "Good," he said, and picked up her bag. They drove back through the dark, quiet January roads of Calder Creek with the heat on and the radio low and the particular comfortable silence of two people who had run out of the need to fill every space. And when he pulled into her mother's driveway, the house was dark except for the kitchen light Eleanor always left on. He carried her bag to the door. She turned on the porch. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." "You said thank you already." I meant it twice. He looked at her in the porch light, and she saw it again, what she'd seen in the kitchen that December night, and had been seeing since, in small doses, in the workshop, and across her mother's dinner table, and through a laptop screen from 2,000 miles away. The thing that was real and patient and specific to her. She stepped forward and kissed him. Not an enormous moment, not a crescendo, just her hands on his jacket and her mouth against his and him. After exactly 1 second of something that might have been surprise or might have been relief, kissing her back. Steady and warm and without performance. They stood on her mother's porch in the January cold for a moment that was both short and long. And when she pulled back, she looked at him and felt, with a clarity she hadn't managed in a year, exactly where she was. I wasn't ready before, she said. In the kitchen. I meant what I said, but I wasn't ready. I know, he said. I waited. You didn't say you were waiting. You needed me not to say I was waiting. She stared at him. That is extremely perceptive of you, she said, with the slightly grudging delivery of someone who found perceptiveness annoying when it was accurate at the wrong moment. He almost smiled. Yeah. Don't be smug about it. I'm not. You're doing a face. I'm not doing a face. She looked at him for a moment. I'm going in, she said. It's freezing. Good night, Hale. Good night, Carter. She went inside. She stood in the warm entry hall of her mother's house with the kitchen light on, and her coat still buttoned and her carry-on at her feet, and the cold air still on her face. She put her hand flat against the front door for a moment. Then she picked up her bag, went upstairs, got into bed, and lay in the dark looking at the ceiling with the particular quality of feeling that had no clean name. Not happiness exactly, not resolution, not the absence of the wound she still carried. Something more complicated and more honest than any of those. Something that felt, in its difficulty and its specificity and its refusal to be simple, like the beginning of something she might actually be able to keep. She was still afraid. She was still scarred. She would wake up some mornings, and the mirror would be hard, and the fear would be present and loud. But she had gone back to San Francisco and walked through the building and sat at her desk and run the board meeting and felt herself land. And she had come home. And she was using that word now, home, for this town and this house. To a man who had driven to an airport at 11 at night without making it into something it needed to be thanked for. She closed her eyes. In the workshop on Merchant Street, the new project under the moving blanket waited to be uncovered. Whatever it was, whatever needed fixing, whatever bones were solid enough to build back from. There was always another one. That was the thing she was learning, slowly, in the way all real things were learned. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small true ones. There was always another one worth working on. The moving blanket came off the new project on a Saturday morning in late January, 3 days after Victoria got back from San Francisco. She'd been asking about it since she'd seen it in the background of their video call, a shape she couldn't identify, covered and waiting, the specific anticipation of something not yet ready to be seen. Ethan had said only that it was complicated, and he'd show her when she was back, which had turned out to be a more effective way to make her want to return quickly than anything else he could have said, though she doubted he'd planned it that way. She came into the workshop at 10 with 2 coffees and found him already at the bench with the blanket folded neatly on the stool. The piece was exposed. It was a writing desk. Small, feminine, federal period. Probably early 19th century, she thought, though she'd learned enough in 4 months to know she was working at the edge of her knowledge. The surface was badly water damaged. The veneer buckled in 2 places, one of the tapered legs cracked near the foot, and repaired at some point in the past with something that had clearly not held. One of the small drawers on the upper section was missing entirely. The brass hardware was tarnished nearly black, but the proportions were extraordinary. Even damaged, even sitting there with its obvious wounds, there was a delicacy to it. The curve of the legs, the slim brass inlay along the writing surface edge, the way the upper section sat above the lower with a lightness that shouldn't have been possible in wood. Where did this come from? She asked. Estate sale in Virginia. A colleague found it and called me. He stood beside her looking at it with the expression she recognized now. Not the finished piece satisfaction, but the earlier one, the one that meant he was seeing what something could be. The family had no idea what it was. They thought it was Victorian. It's not Victorian. No. He glanced at her. Federal. Probably Baltimore, given the inlay style. Around 1800 to 1810. She looked at the water-damaged surface. The veneer's bad. Most of it can be stabilized. There's one panel on the left side that'll need to be replaced, but I can match it close enough. He crouched down to look at the cracked leg. The old repair used the wrong adhesive. I'll have to open it completely and redo it. And the missing drawer? I'll build it. He said it simply, without hesitation. She looked at him. You'll just build an early 19th century drawer from scratch. I'll build it to fit the piece and match the period as close as I can. He straightened up. It won't be original, but it'll be honest. Anyone who knows what they're looking at will be able to tell it's a later edition. I'm not trying to pass it off as something it isn't. She looked at the desk for a long moment. In 4 months, she had watched him restore a Victorian parlor chair, a Federal period roll-top desk, a jewelry box, 2 sets of dining chairs, and a blanket chest that turned out to be significantly older than the client had thought. She had watched him approach each one with the same patient, specific attention, the assessment of what was actually wrong versus what only looked wrong, the distinction between damage that needed to be corrected and damage that had become part of the object's history, the refusal to make something look untouched when the truth of it was that it had been touched, hard, and had survived. She had been watching him restore things for 4 months, and somewhere along the way she had understood that this was also what he'd been doing with her, and she had let him, and it had worked. It's beautiful, she said. About the desk. About all of it. He looked at her sideways. It will be, he said. February came in cold and clear, and Victoria began the thing she had been building toward since January. The careful, deliberate reconstruction of a life that was honest about what it contained. She flew to San Francisco the first week of February, as she'd told Denise she would. Full re-engagement, which meant showing up in the building every day, sitting in the meetings that needed her face and her voice, walking the hallways and the conference rooms and the office kitchen with its specific smell of stale coffee and someone's lunch in the microwave, and finding out what her therapist had predicted she'd find. That the building was hers, that the work was hers, and that the ghost of Marcus Langford occupied approximately 4 rooms in her head and 0 rooms in the actual building. She kept her apartment. She'd made that decision in January, standing in the living room with the bay view at 7 in the morning. And it had been simple in the end. The apartment was hers, had always been hers, and displacing herself from it would be a permanent acknowledgement that his presence in her life had more claim on her space than she did. She repainted the bedroom. Not as therapy, not as a statement. She'd wanted to repaint it for 2 years and had never gotten around to it. She chose a color called mineral that was somewhere between gray and green and was exactly right in the bay light. She worked. She ran the board calls. She had the hard conversations with the investors who'd been watching carefully and needed to see her fully returned, and did not show her the anxiety she felt walking into those rooms because she was still, at her core, someone who could hold a boardroom with a single well-placed sentence, and that had not changed because her body had changed. And the discovery of that specific continuity was one of the better things she found in February. She flew home to Calder Creek every Thursday night. The first time she did it, she didn't think of it as a pattern. She told herself it was because her mother needed some help with the gutters, and she had a board call she could take from anywhere on Friday morning. The second time she told herself there was a specific antique hardware store in Calder Creek she'd been meaning to check for Ethan's desk project. By the third Thursday, she stopped explaining it to herself and just booked the flight. Ethan picked her up twice and met her at her mother's the other times, and the routine that developed between them was not the routine of 2 people in the early, high-voltage stage of something new. It was something more specific and less predictable than that. Meals at the diner or at her mother's or at his house, evenings in the workshop, Saturday mornings where she sat on her stool with her laptop, and he worked on the Federal desk with the focused patience of someone who understood that the right things couldn't be rushed, and the hours passed in the particular quality of time that felt like enough. They argued, more than once, more than twice, real arguments, not performance ones. In early February, she told him he was undercharging for his restoration work by a margin that was professionally embarrassing, and backed it up with an analysis she'd built on her laptop, comparing his rates against comparable craftsmen in Asheville and Charleston and Richmond, and he'd looked at her spreadsheet with the expression of a man confronting a truth he'd been avoiding and said, "I know," and then not immediately changed anything, which drove her approximately insane. "You know, and you're not going to do anything about it?" she said. "I'm going to think about it." "Ethan, the Charleston guy does less precise work than you and charges 40% more." "I know. So I'll think about it." "That's not Victoria." He looked at her with the patient, slightly immovable quality that she had stopped confusing with passivity. I've been running this workshop for 8 years. I know what it's worth. I also know my clients, and I know what I'm comfortable with, and I'm going to think about it and adjust on my own timeline. He paused. Not yours. She stared at him. Your timeline is too slow, she said. Your timeline is too fast, he said. Has been since I met you. She opened her mouth, closed it, turned back to her laptop with the specific controlled energy of a person who knew they'd walked into a fair point and was unwilling to fully concede it. He raised his rates 3 weeks later, not by 40%, by 22, which he'd arrived at through his own analysis that he showed her without comment, and which was correct for his specific market and client base in a way she had to admit her broader comparison hadn't fully accounted for. This is better than my recommendation, she said, studying it. It accounts for the Calder Creek market specifically, not Charleston. I know. She looked at him. I was wrong about the number. You were right about the concept. He said it without the particular triumph of someone waiting for the concession. Just accurate. I needed to think through the specifics. She felt something that was both frustration and admiration in a ratio that kept shifting, and thought that this was probably the most honest thing that could be said about the experience of knowing him. The call from Marcus came on a Tuesday afternoon in late February. She was at her San Francisco apartment, at her desk, in the middle of a draft infrastructure proposal for the Q2 roadmap. Her phone lit up with a number she'd moved to her blocked list in October, and then unblocked in a moment of misguided generosity. She'd immediately regretted, and his name sat on her screen for exactly 4 rings while she looked at it. She thought about what would happen if she answered. She'd been in therapy long enough and was honest enough with herself to run the scenario with some accuracy. His voice, which she knew well, would be careful and measured. He would probably say he'd been thinking about her. He might use the word sorry, which was a word she'd never once heard him use in the 3 years they were together, which told her something about the distance between what it would cost him to say it now and whether he actually understood what it would need to mean. He would possibly say he'd made a mistake. He might say he wanted to see her. She thought about what she would feel, hearing all of that. She thought, not enough. Not enough to rearrange what she'd rebuilt. Not enough to be worth the backslide, the reopening of the specific wound he'd made, the long process of reclosing it. Not even enough to be interesting. What Marcus Langford felt or wanted or regretted in late February was simply no longer information she needed. She picked up the phone and declined the call. She set it face down on the desk. She sat there for a moment, waiting for the feeling that she used to get. The complicated one, the pulling in 2 directions thing, the small involuntary flicker that she'd hated herself for feeling. She waited for it the way you probe a bruise to see if it still hurts. It wasn't there. Or rather, it was there, in the way that scar tissue is there. Present, part of the structure, but not the wound itself. Not pain, just the shape that the healing had left. She picked the phone back up and texted Ethan. He called. I declined it. The response came 4 minutes later. How do you feel? She looked at the question. It was the right question. Not good, or are you okay, or any of the managed responses. Just, how do you feel? Asking for the actual answer. Fine, she typed. Then deleted it. Started again. Like I thought I'd feel something bigger, and I didn't. Which is either progress, or I'm still numb. His response was faster this time. Which does it feel like? She looked at that for a moment, looked at her Q2 roadmap on the screen, looked at the bay through the window, gray-green in the February afternoon. Progress, she typed. I think it's progress. Then it is. She put the phone down. She went back to the infrastructure proposal, and she worked through the afternoon with the particular focused ease of someone who has put something down and found their hands free for the thing in front of them. And by 6 o'clock she had a draft she was genuinely satisfied with, which had not happened on a first draft in longer than she could remember. She called her therapist that evening and told her about the call. Her therapist said what she'd been moving Victoria toward for months, the thing she'd been circling in different words since September. The goal was never to stop feeling something about him. The goal was to stop letting what you feel about him be the loudest thing in the room. Victoria sat with that on the phone. It wasn't, she said. Today. It wasn't the loudest thing. What was? She thought about the infrastructure proposal, about the Q2 roadmap, about Ethan's text and the particular quality of relief she'd felt reading it, not because he'd said something that fixed anything, but because he'd asked the right question instead. Work, she said. And something else. Her therapist, who was professionally excellent, did not push on the something else. That sounds right, she said instead. That sounds like where you're supposed to be. March brought two things that arrived in the same week and changed the shape of the future in ways Victoria had been building toward without entirely realizing it. The first was a conversation with Denise that had been building since January. They had it in Victoria's office on a Thursday morning, the bay a strip of silver behind the buildings outside the window, and it was one of the most honest, professional conversations Victoria had ever had, which was saying something because she'd built a company on the premise that honest conversations, however uncomfortable, were more efficient than managed ones. Denise sat across from her and said, without preamble, "I want the COO title to reflect what I'm actually doing." "You've had it for 2 years," Victoria said. "I want it to reflect it more formally, with the compensation structure to match." She didn't blink. "And I want formal shared authority on operational decisions, not sign-off, shared." Victoria looked at her. The thing about Denise was that she was right. She had been running the operational reality of Hale Logic for 2 years with a title and a compensation structure that had been accurate when she was first promoted and had not kept pace with what she'd actually become. Victoria had known this and had been moving toward correcting it and had not moved fast enough, partly because of everything else, and partly because formalizing Denise's authority meant formalizing Victoria's own step back from certain things. And that step back carried an identity weight she hadn't been ready to handle. She was ready now. "I'll have legal draft the amended structure by end of next week," Victoria said, "and we'll do the compensation review properly, benchmarked externally, not internal comparison." Denise held her gaze for a moment. "That's it?" she said. "You were right. It should have happened 6 months ago." Victoria paused. "I've been in a process of figuring out what my role looks like going forward. This is part of that." "What does it look like going forward?" Victoria considered. "Smaller on a daily basis, bigger on a strategic one." She paused. "I'm going to be in Calder Creek more than San Francisco for a while. Maybe longer than a while." Denise nodded slowly, not surprised. "Because of the carpenter." Victoria looked at her. "Josie Carter is LinkedIn connected to 3 people in this office," Denise said, with the dry precision of someone who had more information than they'd indicated. "Word travels. He restores antique furniture." "The carpenter," Denise said again, but she was almost smiling. "Does this affect your availability? Thursdays and Fridays I'll be in North Carolina most weeks. Monday through Wednesday here, or remote. Board calls and major client meetings I'll be in person for." She paused. "The company doesn't need me in the building every day. It needs me making the right calls. I can do that from anywhere with decent Wi-Fi." Denise looked at her for a moment. The long, assessing look of a woman who had been watching Victoria run on empty for a year and was now looking at something different. "Okay," she said. "I think that's the right structure." "You would have told me if it wasn't." "Immediately," Denise agreed. She stood. "For what it's worth, you seem like yourself again." Victoria looked at the bay. "Working on it," she said. But she said it differently than she'd said it to Howard Park in January. Less like a goal and more like a true description of an ongoing, permanent, non-terrible process. The second thing that arrived that week was a phone call from Lily. She was at her mother's house Thursday evening when her phone rang with a number she recognized as Ethan's, but the voice that came through when she answered was not his. "It's Lily," said a small, serious voice. "Dad said I could call if you didn't pick up because he's driving." Victoria put down the book she'd been reading. "Hi, Lily. I wanted to tell you that I finished the book on South American cats." A pause, the considering pause of someone organizing information. "Did you know that jaguars can swim? Like actually, well, not just across water. They hunt in the water." "I didn't know that," Victoria said. "They're the only big cat in the Americas. The other ones are technically medium cats." Another pause. "Dad says you know a lot about business. Do you think there's a business where you could study jaguars?" "Conservation biology," Victoria said, "or zoology, if you wanted to study them scientifically." She thought for a moment. "Or wildlife documentary work, if you wanted to make films about them. Or conservation policy, which is more the business side, working to protect their habitat from development." A silence that felt like Lily writing something down, or at least filing it. "I'm 7, Lily said. "I know, you have time." "How old were you when you knew what you wanted to do?" Victoria thought about it. "I was about 19 when I had the idea that turned into my company. but I'd been building toward it since I was probably your age. I just didn't know that's what I was doing. What were you doing? Figuring out how systems worked, why some things were organized one way and other ways would be more efficient. She paused. I used to reorganize my mother's kitchen cabinets. She hated it. Lily made a sound that might have been a laugh. I reorganized Dad's tool wall. He doesn't hate it. No, Victoria said. I don't think he would. There was a sound in the background, a car door, and then Ethan's voice, slightly distant. Lily, let me have the phone. I'm not done, Lily said. Lily, a pause. Then, to Victoria, in a lower voice with the compressed speed of someone who knew the call was about to end. The Jaguar I made you is on Dad's workbench. He keeps moving it to the good spot by the window. Victoria felt something in her chest go completely, quietly still. Tell him I noticed, she said. Lily made a satisfied sound and passed the phone. Ethan's voice came on, slightly winded, slightly amused. Sorry, she borrowed my phone while I was paying for gas. She told me about jaguar swimming. She tells everyone about jaguar swimming. He paused. Did she ask you about careers in cat research? Conservation biology and wildlife documentary work. He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't expecting that answer. She has specific interests. She needs specific information. Yeah. His voice was quiet in the way it got when something moved him that he wasn't going to say directly. I know. She heard the car start, traffic sounds. I'll see you tomorrow, she said. I'll be at the workshop. I know. She paused. Lily said the Jaguar is by the window. A beat. Then, very dry. The light's better there. Sure, she said. Good night, Hale. Good night, Carter. She put the phone down on her mother's kitchen table and sat for a moment in the warm quiet of the house. Eleanor was in the living room with the news on low. Outside, the March night was sharp and clear, the first real hint of spring in the air. The particular promise of it, not warm yet, but no longer purely cold. She thought about Lily on the phone, organizing information about jaguars with the focused seriousness of a child who had decided something was worth knowing. She thought about the small clay jaguar on the windowsill in the workshop, in the good light. She thought about the federal writing desk, which was now 3 weeks into Ethan's restoration, the water-damaged veneer stabilized, the cracked leg rebuilt, the new drawer he was making from scratch in the same period style. She'd watched him work on the drawer twice, the precision of it, the way he measured and remeasured and rejected 2 attempts before the third one matched the proportion he was after. Why does it have to be exact? She'd asked once. The client will never notice a couple of millimeters. I'll notice, he'd said. That's not efficient. No, he'd agreed, without altering his approach by a single degree. She understood now what she hadn't understood in October when she'd stood in the workshop for the first time and watched him work. The efficiency wasn't the point. The point was the object itself, the thing that would outlast both of them, that some person in 100 years would open and run their hands over without knowing anything about the workshop in Calder Creek, or the man who'd spent 3 weeks getting the drawer proportion exactly right. The point was doing it correctly for its own sake, because the work itself was the value, not the recognition of the work. She had spent 8 years building a company on the premise that faster and leaner and more efficient was always better, and she had built something real and lasting with that premise. She still believed it in the domain where it was true, but she had also, somewhere in these months, learned the other thing. The thing Ethan's grandfather had apparently told him about the parts nobody could see. The thing about doing the work correctly even when no one would know. The two things didn't cancel each other out. They just applied to different parts of a life. Hers, she was beginning to understand, needed to contain both. The morning in late March that she would remember as the day things became fully, irreversibly real started badly. She woke up at her mother's house and the mirror was hard. Not violent. She was past the worst of the violent mornings, the ones that had put her on the edge of the bathtub at 2 a.m. But it was hard. She looked at herself and felt the familiar weight of the inventory. The scar, the places where her body still felt changed, the specific grief of what the surgery had taken and what it had left. The grief that didn't leave completely, that she'd been told by her doctor and her therapist and by everything she'd read on the subject was not a deficiency in her healing, but simply the accurate weight of something real. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Not as long as she used to. 10 minutes, maybe, rather than the 20 or 30 that had been necessary in the fall. Then she got up, washed her face, put on jeans and the gray cashmere sweater she'd bought in February, because she'd seen it in a shop window and wanted it, and had bought it without spending 20 minutes talking herself into it, which was its own kind of progress. She went downstairs. Her mother was at the kitchen table with her coffee, reading something on her tablet, and looked up when Victoria came in. Eleanor had gotten good at this, the reading of her daughter's face, the distinction between the days that needed something and the days that needed nothing. She got up and poured Victoria a coffee and put it on the table without comment, and sat back down and said after a moment, "There's a thing at the botanical garden today. Just opened, if you want company." Victoria looked at the coffee. "Maybe later," she said. She drove to the workshop. Ethan was at the federal desk, which was in its final stage now. The surface treatment, the careful application of the period-appropriate finish that he'd spent a week researching and testing on sample pieces. The workshop smelled strongly of the finish compound. He had the windows cracked despite the March cold, and was working with a soft cloth in slow, even strokes. He looked up when she came in. He read her face in the way he read it now, accurately, without either overreading or underreading. "Bad morning?" he said. "Medium morning." She took her stool, didn't open her laptop. Mirror was hard. He nodded. Didn't fill the space. Kept working. She sat there for a while and let the workshop do what it did. The smell and the sound and the light through the high windows, and the simple fact of him working with his hands on something that needed patience, and her sitting in it, and the particular absence of demand in it. "It doesn't go away," she said. "Completely." "No," he said. "My doctor said 6 to 12 months for the full emotional adjustment, which sounded reasonable in October and sounds insane now that I'm living it. How long has it been?" 8 months since the surgery, 7 since Marcus left. She looked at the desk. "Some days it's nothing, some days it's everything." "What's today?" "Medium, like I said." She watched him work. "My therapist says the goal isn't 0 days. The goal is to not let the bad days run the whole show." "She's right." "I know." She paused. "I hate that she's always right." He almost smiled. "No, you don't." "No, I don't," she admitted. "It's annoying, but it's useful. I like things that are useful." He looked at her then, over his shoulder, with the expression that meant something was about to be said that mattered. "Victoria." "Yeah." "You know what I think about on the days you're not here?" She looked at him. "I think about showing you things," he said. "When I find something in a piece that's interesting. When the finish does something unexpected. When I figure out a problem." He turned back to the desk. "I think about what you'd say about it. Whether you'd already know or whether you'd ask the question nobody else thinks to ask." She was quiet. "I'm telling you that," he continued, "because I want you to know what you are to me. Not in the abstract, specifically." He ran the cloth along the desk surface in a slow, even stroke. "You're the person I think of when something's worth thinking about." She looked at the back of his head, at his shoulders, at the careful, patient movement of his hands. She thought about who she had been in October, standing in her mother's rain-soaked driveway, believing herself to be a person that no one could want anymore. The specific, devastating certainty of it. The way it had lived in her like a stone she carried, the weight of it so constant she'd started to think it was just her own density. She thought about Marcus on his phone in the dark, and the hallway where she'd stood listening, and the 4 hours on the edge of the bed, and the kitchen table and the careful voice, and the ring she'd handed back. She thought about all of it, and then she thought about this. The workshop, and the man in it, the November rain, and the porch, and the drawer that finally closed, and the finished chair, and the December kitchen, and the January airport, and the February road map, and Lily's phone call, and the clay Jaguar, in the good light by the window. The stone was still there. She didn't think it would ever be entirely gone. It had become part of her structure. The same way the scar was part of her structure. The same way any experience that changes you becomes part of what you are. You didn't get to excise it. You got to decide how much weight you gave it. "I think about you too," she said. "When things are worth thinking about." He turned and looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I know. Don't be smug about it." "I'm not. I'm just—" He looked at her with the open expression, the one she'd stopped being startled by. "Glad." The word was so small and so precisely right that she felt it all the way through. Glad. Not triumphant, not relieved, not performing happiness for an audience, just glad. The simple, private, specific satisfaction of a person whose life contained something worth being glad about. She picked up her coffee. "The desk looks good," she said. "2 more sessions on the surface, then it's done." "What's next?" He reached under the bench and produced a photograph, printed on regular paper, the image slightly grainy. A secretary bookcase, full height, with glass-fronted upper doors and a fold-down writing surface. Obviously old, obviously damaged. She could see from the photograph that the glass was broken in one upper door and the writing surface hinge was completely gone. "Where is it?" she asked. "Owner's in Asheville. She found it in a farmhouse she inherited. No idea of the history." He looked at the photograph. "But the style is Hepplewhite. See the inlay on the upper doors? That's the same Baltimore school as the desk." She looked at the photograph more carefully. "You think it's the same workshop? Same maker?" "Different hand, but same period, same regional tradition." He paused. "Possibly same original household." She looked at him. "You're telling me you might have found 2 pieces from the same house," she said. "I'm saying it's possible." He was careful about it, not claiming more than the evidence supported. "I'm going up to Asheville next week to look at it in person." "I want to come," she said. He looked at her. "I want to see it," she said. "If you're right about the connection, I might not be." "If you might be right," she said. "I want to see it." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to understand was him deciding something. "Saturday," he said. "We'll go Saturday. Lily's at Claire's for the weekend." "Saturday," she said. She looked at the photograph. 2 pieces from the same house, separated by 200 years and 500 miles, finding their way to the same workshop in a small North Carolina town. She didn't know what that meant exactly. It didn't mean anything, perhaps, except what you decided to make of it. But she felt the pull of it, the same way she felt the pull of any system that revealed itself to have more internal structure than was visible on the surface. There was a word for that, she thought. A thing that looked like coincidence until you had enough information to see that it was actually pattern. She thought about herself in October, the person who'd believed her wounds had made her worth less. She thought about what it had taken to get from there to here. Not a single moment of grace, not a redemption arc that arrived on schedule. Months. Hard ones. Mirrors that were still hard sometimes. A fear that still lived in her nervous system and probably always would to some degree. Work she'd had to do on herself that was ongoing and unglamorous and involved a significant amount of crying in a therapist's office, and at least 3 mornings on the edge of a bathtub, and a workshop on Merchant Street, and a man with old chisels and an exact sense of what things were worth, and a 7-year-old who called to tell her about jaguar swimming, and a mother who kept the kitchen light on. None of it had fixed her. She was not fixed. She was someone who had been changed by damage, and was still in the process of learning what the changed version of herself could do. But she was here. She was actually, genuinely here. In this town, in this workshop, in this life that she had not planned, and could not have designed, and would not trade for the penthouse and the ring, and the careful, rehearsed voice of a man who had mistaken her body for the entirety of her worth. The right person, she understood now, didn't love you in spite of what had broken. That framing was still too clean, still the framework of the wound, the before and after of the damage. The right person didn't evaluate the inventory and arrive at a verdict. The right person just looked at you, the whole version, the ongoing version, the still changing version, and stayed. Not because you'd been proven worth it, because he'd already decided in the plain, matter-of-fact way that certain people made decisions, and the deciding was the thing that mattered, and he wasn't going to keep putting it up for review. Outside on Merchant Street, a late March wind moved through the bare trees, and somewhere down the block someone's door opened and closed. The workshop held its particular morning quiet. The federal writing desk sat near the window in the early light, its new surface glowing, its rebuilt drawer fitting true, 200 years of history intact, including the hard parts. Especially the hard parts, because those were the ones you could see and trust. "Coffee's cold," Ethan said, without looking up. "I know. There's more." "I know." She sat on her stool in the morning light and watched him work, and felt the specific weight of a life that was not perfect and not simple and not done being what it needed to be. A life that had room in it for hard mornings and necessary work, and a man who thought about her when something was worth thinking about, and a child who called to report on jaguar facts, and a company she'd built from nothing that was still standing, and a drawer that finally, after all of it, closed clean. She was not healed. She was better than she'd been. She was still going to be better than that. The light through the workshop windows moved across the floor in the slow, particular way it moved in the morning. The kind of light that didn't ask anything of you, that was just there, doing what light did, warming the old wood and the new finish and the quiet space between two people who had figured out how to tell each other the truth. That was enough. That was, in the end, more than enough. It was everything.